In 1975, Will Durant published the 11th and last volume on the story of civilization, The Age of Napoleon. Will and Ariel Durant confess. According to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, by the middle of the 20th century, the literature on Napoleon already numbered more than 100,000 volumes. Why add to this heap? We offer no better reason than to say that the Reaper repeatedly overlooked us and left us to passive living and passive reading after 1968. We grew weary of this insipid and unaccustomed leisure. To give our days some purpose and program, we decided to apply to the Age of Napoleon, 1789 to 1815, our favorite method of integral history, weaving into one narrative all memorable aspects of European civilization in those 27 years. Statesmanship, war, economics, morals, manners, religion, science, medicine, philosophy, literature, drama, music, and art, to see them all as elements in one moving picture and as interacting parts of a united whole. It was quite a web to weave, with threads connecting figures from all walks of life. Prime Minister William Pitt ordering the arrest of author Tom Paine, chemist Lavoisier, and mystic Charlotte Corday meeting their fates on the guillotine. Admiral Nelson taking Lady Hamilton as his mistress, Goethe foreseeing a century of events from the Battle of Valmy, Wordsworth enthusiastically embracing the French Revolution, Byron the Greek, and Shelley preaching atheism to Oxford bishops and dons, and of course, Napoleon fighting kings and imprisoning a pope. I had nurtured, since my adolescence, a profound interest in Napoleon. I viewed him not as merely a warmonger and despot, but as a philosopher who had never been deceived by pretense, and as a psychologist who had constantly studied human nature both in the mass and individual men. The book itself was a 5-year undertaking, although it really needed a lifetime. It did seem both too long and too short all at once, and it was written under the shadow of time. All in all, in life and history, we have found so many good men and women that we have quite lost faith in the wickedness of mankind. Each volume and chapter in this series can be listened to independently. You can sit back and watch the story unfold, or skip to the sections that resonate most with the events around you. The following is a comprehensive summary of the story of civilization, the Age of Napoleon, highlighting its finest moments. Chapter 1. The Background of Revolution. The French people. France, a nation of significant population, was not a land of equal opportunity. Instead, it operated like a gladiatorial arena where distinct social classes battled for scarce resources. Society was sharply divided into 3 estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the vast majority of the population, known as the tiers état, the third estate. The third estate, the backbone of the economy, shouldered the heaviest taxes yet held no political power. Frustration simmered as they saw the entrenched elite thrive, igniting a spark that would soon explode into revolution. Their rich raiment, fine manners, and general amiability seemed, in 1789, insufficient reason for owning a fourth of the soil and exacting feudal dues. Within the third estate itself, diversity abounded. The wealthier middle class, driving the nation's economy, felt shackled by outdated social constraints. Meanwhile, workers and peasants faced crushing hardship. High prices, low wages, and catastrophic crop failures painted a bleak picture. In 1788, a devastating trifecta, a severe drought, a destructive hailstorm, and the coldest winter in 80 years, pushed millions to starvation. Trade agreements flooded the market with foreign goods, forcing many out of jobs. People refused to pay taxes. The government. A nation in turmoil needs a strong leader. France, however, was led by King Louis XVI, a man more enamored with locksmithing than leadership. While the country burned with unrest, he busied himself with crafting locks, disconnected from the struggles of his people. He meticulously tracked his hunting exploits, with 200,000 kills, but hesitated to act decisively in matters of state. This oddity in character, focused on triviality over human suffering, underscored his unsuitability to lead. Adding to the discontent was his queen, Marie Antoinette. Her charm and gaiety dazzled the court, but her extravagance drained the nation's already fragile finances. Louis XVI did attempt reform, but his efforts lacked conviction. He condemned forced labor and acknowledged the unfair tax burden on the poor. He even freed serfs on his lands, yet refused to challenge the clergy and nobility to do the same. As financial ruin loomed, the king made a desperate move, summoning a gathering of nobles not convened since 1614. In a gesture to placate the Third Estate, he granted them as many deputies and votes as the other two estates combined. This decision, though well-intentioned, inadvertently empowered the very group most disillusioned by his reign. The Third Estate seized the opportunity, voicing their grievances and demanding change. Reports called for the end of the divine right of kings and the creation of a constitutional assembly to resolve the nation's crises. It became clear that the monarchy's days were numbered. The elites, ensconced in comfort and arrogance, underestimated the tide of discontent. Chapter 2. The National Assembly. The States General. The scene opened with grandeur and ceremony. The Third Estate, draped in bourgeois black, marched solemnly before the monarchy, appearing almost pitiable. The king's admission of bankruptcy, followed by Necker's dreary litany of statistics, hinted at a decaying system. Then came the pivotal moment. The commoners armed themselves, making no polite request for reform, but an assertion of will. The Bastille, a crumbling fortress more symbolic than strategic, became the target. It stood not as a prison, but as a representation of tyranny. They scaled its walls, fired cannons, and stormed its gates. Soldiers fired, but the crowd pressed on, unstoppable. In hours, the Bastille fell, a brutal triumph that dismantled a monument to oppression. Shocked and powerless, the king conceded, dismissing his troops from Versailles and Paris. Dominance had been asserted, not negotiated. The Great Fear. France was teetering on the brink of anarchy. As Morris observed, this country is as near to dissolution as society can approach. Peasants, gripped by the Great Fear, armed themselves and rose against their oppressors. Chateaux burned, title deeds were destroyed, and the old order crumbled. With laws unenforced and magistrates powerless, chaos reigned. Durant recounted, in 6 months, 400,000 guns were acquired by alarmed citizens. When the fear subsided, those weapons turned on tax collectors, monopolists, and feudal lords. The nobles had no choice but to concede. The Vicomte de Noailles declared, "All feudal dues shall be redeemable," signaling the end of an era. This was not an act of goodwill, it was the result of force. Revolution had become inevitable. The march to Versailles. Hunger drove the people to act again. A wave of market women, desperate for bread, marched to Versailles. "We will bring back the baker and the baker's wife," they vowed. Their determination shattered the illusion of royal invulnerability. As dawn broke, they poured through the gates of the palace, relentless and unyielding. By the end, the king and queen were escorted back to Paris in a grim procession. Behind them, carts of flour and the heads of guards on pikes. The revolutionary constitution. In 1790, the bourgeois assembly drafted a constitution full of promise and contradiction. Equality before the law and abolition of hereditary privileges hinted at progress. The right to vote and hold office remained tied to wealth, preserving control for the elite. The church was stripped of its lands, its clergy reduced to state employees. Most bishops and priests refused to comply. On the first anniversary of the Bastille's fall, a grand celebration on the Champ de Mars united the nation. It was a moment of collective hope, though beneath it lay careful manipulation. Progress, it seemed, was often a guise for consolidating power. Mirabeau's betrayal. Mirabeau, once a revolutionary hero, made his choice. He saw salvation in a coalition between king and assembly. In exchange for clearing his debts and a monthly stipend, he lent his support to the monarchy. But his influence faded, and when his secret dealings were exposed, his reputation crumbled. In death, his legacy bore the stain of compromise. Power, his story suggested, is never truly pure. The flight to Varennes. In 1791, the king attempted to flee. Disguised as commoners, the royal family slipped out of Paris under cover of darkness. Their journey was one of hope and fear, but it ended in failure. At Varennes, peasants armed with pitchforks and clubs stopped them. Dragged back to Paris, the king signed away his remaining authority under duress. The people had spoken, Power lay no longer in tradition, but in the force of law. Even the assembly, having completed its work, dissolved itself. Revolutionary energy gave way to the challenges of governance. Those who build systems of power rarely stay to rule them. Chapter 3. The Legislative Assembly. The players of the drama. The French populace found itself awash in a torrent of new ideas. Journalists, claiming an almost divine authority, spread their views with unrelenting zeal. Newspapers, like wildflowers or weeds, sprang up across the landscape of public opinion. Debate clubs became the crucibles of political upheaval. Napoleon, ever astute, remarked, "The old nobility would have survived if it had controlled printing materials. The cannon ended feudalism. Ink will extinguish the modern system." He was right. Paris teemed with clubs of every stripe, literary, social, even drinking societies, all vying for influence. This wasn't idle chatter, it was a struggle for dominance. In 1791, an English observer noted, "Clubs abound in every street." The commencement of war, 1792. The year 1792 was a forge, and in its fires, the true mettle of men was revealed. The monarchy, the revolutionaries, the generals, all pursued their ambitions. The monarchy sought to reclaim its grip on power, the revolutionaries their vision of transformation, the generals, glory and personal advancement. Leopold's declarations lit the spark. War came hastily, without caution, driven by dreams rather than strategy. Soldiers, ordinary men plucked from fields and homes, marched under officers still untested in command. Amid this fervor, the Marseillaise was born. A song of passion, it rallied hearts before battles began. It justified the violence to come, promising a vision that many would follow. The influence of Danton. Georges Danton gained his fame as a supporter of the revolution. Danton declared, "A proletarian dictatorship is a contradiction in terms, a moment in political time. The tocsin we shall sound is not the alarm signal of danger," he proclaimed. "It orders the charge on the enemies of France. To conquer, we must dare, dare again, always dare, and France is saved." The bloodshed of September 1792. In September 1792, chaos reached its zenith. The men of France were away at war, and fear seized the government at home. Churches were secularized, clergymen executed, and a deep madness gripped the streets. Fear gave way to violence as men became hunters in a grim game of survival and dominance. Stories emerged, one of a soldier consuming the heart of his fallen adversary. A river of blood must flow between the Parisians and the émigrés, they believed. When urged to halt the slaughter, Danton replied coldly, "It would be impossible. Why should I trouble myself about royalists and priests waiting for foreigners to massacre us? We must instill fear into our enemies." Chapter 4. The Convention. The New Republic. The dawn of the New Republic was cloaked in the guise of democracy, a spectacle of indirect elections. Voters chose electors, who then gathered in committees to select deputies. It appeared as though the people held power, yet the elites retained control. The masses saw through this facade. Out of 7 million eligible voters, 6.3 million abstained, their silence a protest against the farce. In Paris, the Jacobin Club wielded disproportionate influence, becoming the epicenter of decision-making. Meanwhile, political factions, the Girondins and Montagnards, engaged in power struggles. Some revolutionaries, like Danton, enriched themselves amid the chaos. The Second Revolution. The execution of King Louis XVI was inevitable after the discovery of his secret communications with counter-revolutionaries. The iron box found in his chambers confirmed his betrayal of the constitution he swore to uphold. This act sealed his fate and further destabilized France. Foreign monarchies, alarmed by this challenge to their authority, waged war against the limping republic. France's military, disorganized and poorly led, faltered under pressure. Troop numbers dwindled, conscription caused resentment, and corruption flourished. In this chaos, power consolidated into centralized government committees, chief among them the Revolutionary Tribunal. This body held unchecked authority, laying the groundwork for the reign of the Committee of Public Safety. The Second Revolution replaced bourgeois influence with what was heralded as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Promises of liberty dissolved into deeper authoritarianism. A new constitution was drafted but never implemented, overshadowed by the supreme power of the committee. The assassination of Marat. July 13, 1793, saw Charlotte Corday assassinate Jean-Paul Marat, a radical voice of the revolution. Corday sought to change the course of events, but her actions only fueled further repression. Marat became a martyr, a cult figure manipulated to reinforce the narrative of revolutionary zeal, the Great Committee, and the struggle for unity. 12 men of the committee directed France with hard resolve, their motto, unity, their method, terror. France was besieged on all fronts, internally by civil war and externally by foreign invasions. Through sheer brutality, they forged political unity at the cost of countless lives. The Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror exploited both internal dissent and external threats. Food shortages, economic turmoil, and unchecked greed fueled discontent. The law of suspects criminalized broad swaths of the population, legitimizing mass arrests and executions. Marie Antoinette and countless others fell victim to the guillotine, symbolic sacrifices in a frenzy of fear. Entire regions, like Lyons, were decimated in acts of cruelty. Religion, too, was targeted, replaced with hollow spectacles to assert ideological dominance. Even revolutionary leaders were not spared. Hébert, Danton, and others who once held power met the same brutal fate they had prescribed for others, the Thermidorian. By 1794, Robespierre and his allies fell, marking the revolution's shift into the hands of the Thermidorians. They promised stability, but maintained power through familiar tactics of suppression and manipulation. Economic turmoil persisted, and coups further eroded any sense of order. Yet amidst the wreckage, a young general, Napoleon Bonaparte, rose. With calculated ruthlessness, he restored a semblance of order, setting the stage for a new era of centralized power. Chapter 5. The Directory. The New Government. Picture a government with 3 heads, a true representation of inefficiency. The legislature had 2 branches, the Council of 500, where endless debates echoed, and the Council of Ancients, older members tasked with approving law. Above them sat the Directory, 5 men battling for power, their alliances shifting as often as the wind. This was a maze of bureaucracy. Most of the members were regicides, men who had signed the death warrant of a king. One such figure, Paul Barras, embodied ruthless opportunism, aligning with the king, then the revolutionary Robespierre, and outliving both. As Will Durant observed, survival was their only morality. Paris teetered on the edge of financial ruin, prices soared as the currency plummeted, speculators swooped in, profiting from misery. Bankruptcies and unemployment spread like wildfire, leaving the Directory scrambling for answers. Their attempts to restore order were tepid, lacking vision or the spark to inspire the disillusioned populace. In this void, radical voices gained traction again. Babeuf, a man of communistic ideals, declared that nature made all men equal and so should society. With his band of equals, he sought to erase inequality by force, promising shared happiness through revolution. Their uprising of 1796 was swiftly crushed. Babeuf, captured and imprisoned, attempted suicide but ultimately met the guillotine. His dream failed because it placed faith in an ideal, not the power to enact it. And so, the chaos begged for a figure to impose order, a force to reshape destiny. The young Napoleon, 1769-95. Will Durant called him a mind invigorating to watch, a man whose intellect and ambition had no equal. Born in Corsica in 1769, Napoleon entered the world just as his island was absorbed by France. "I was born when my country was dying," he would later lament, scarred by the violent loss of his homeland's liberty. At 10, he entered the military school at Brienne. As a foreigner, he endured ridicule but found refuge in books, absorbing mathematics, science, and the exploits of history's great conquerors. At 16, he graduated from the prestigious École Militaire, becoming a second lieutenant of artillery. Napoleon devoured knowledge, from Machiavelli's The Prince to military strategy, driven by a thirst to rise above mediocrity. Yet he wrestled with despair, admitting once, "Perhaps it would be better if I ended my life." Instead, he channeled this turmoil into a relentless ambition. The French Revolution provided an opening, and Napoleon, despite initial doubts, supported its promise of merit over privilege. His first taste of triumph came at Toulon, where his artillery tactics earned him a promotion to brigadier general. But with Robespierre's fall, he was briefly imprisoned. Josephine de Beauharnais. In the orbit of power stood Josephine, a Creole woman with a past as strategic as her charm was intoxicating. Married young to the aristocratic Viscount Alexander de Beauharnais, she endured infidelity and betrayal. Josephine's beauty and wit opened doors, and her connections in Parisian society were unmatched. Napoleon, captivated by her allure, saw in her not just a lover but a stepping stone. Their marriage in 1796 was pragmatic, a union of ambition rather than passion. Despite their entanglement, their lives were driven by different desires. Napoleon's were for conquest, Josephine's for influence. The Italian Campaign, 1796–97. In 1796, Napoleon took command of the ragged army of Italy. Facing starvation and defeat, he rallied his troops. "I am leading you to fertile plains and wealth beyond measure." He then outmaneuvered the Austrian and Sardinian forces, delivering victory after victory at Montanati, Dago, and Mondovi. His strategy was swift and unrelenting, breaking through enemy lines before they could regroup. With each triumph, he demanded respect from his men and discipline in victory, building an army as loyal as it was formidable. Napoleon's letters to Josephine during this time revealed a man torn between love and ambition. "Not a day passes without my loving you," he wrote, even as he outmaneuvered armies and reshaped Europe. But his devotion to her was one-sided. While Napoleon yearned, Josephine strayed, her actions threatening to undermine his focus. Still, his victories in Italy culminated in the Treaty of Campo Formio, securing French dominance and marking Napoleon as a statesman as well as a general. The coup of 18th Fructidor. By 1797, Paris was a city divided. Monarchists sought to restore the old regime, while Republicans clung to the revolution's ideals. Napoleon, seeing an opportunity, sent his loyal general Augereau to crush opposition and solidify the Directory's power. His return to Paris in December 1797 was triumphant. He brought not just military success, but treasures and a vision for France's future. Napoleon was no longer just a soldier, he was becoming a legend. The Egyptian Campaign, 1798–99. Napoleon's ambitions reached beyond Europe. Egypt, he believed, was the key to undermining British dominance and paving a path to India. The Directory, eager to keep him far from Paris, sanctioned the campaign. With an army, scientists, and the weight of history behind him, Napoleon set sail. His conquest of Malta was bloodless, his arrival in Egypt dramatic, the journey to Alexandria and the Desert Campaign. Napoleon's forces landed on an undefended beach near Alexandria, swiftly capturing the city through a mix of military strategy and diplomatic finesse. He declared his intent not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, freeing Egypt from Mameluke mercenaries who had made themselves masters of Egypt. The message was clear: their way of life would be respected, but a new order would emerge under French control. The march into Egypt was grueling. Scorching deserts, relentless thirst, swarming insects, and unyielding sands tested every soldier's endurance. Their first trial came at Cobrequet, but the true test was at the pyramids. Here, on July 20th, Napoleon inspired his troops with a rallying cry: "Soldiers, from atop these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." With this, they defeated a formidable Mameluke force and took Cairo. Conquering Cairo and establishing order, victory brought not only conquest but administration. Napoleon set up a local government led by Arab leaders, ensuring the property of civilians was respected and his troops followed strict discipline. He supported Islamic culture, understanding that true power must balance force with respect for local traditions. The Institute of Egypt, established under his guidance, became an intellectual collaboration between French and Egyptian minds. It was here that Bouchard discovered the Rosetta Stone. Reflecting on his time in Egypt, Napoleon mused, "The time I spent in Egypt was the most delightful of my life. I dreamed all sorts of things, and I saw how they might be realized." His vision extended beyond conquest. It was about creating a legacy that bridged past and future, betrayal, loss, and resilience. Even in triumph, a shadow loomed over him. News of Josephine's infidelity reached him, plunging him into despair. "I am sick of society. I need solitude. Glory has lost its charm. Only complete egotism remains," he lamented. He sought solace in a new mistress, Pauline Ferress, but emotional distractions began to strain his focus. Disaster struck when Admiral Nelson annihilated the French fleet at Aboukir Bay on July 31, 1798. 13 French ships were destroyed, cutting Napoleon off from reinforcements and isolating his forces. Despite this crushing blow, he displayed grace and compassion, consoling the family of a fallen soldier. This ability to project strength even in failure revealed his character, a man who could adapt, endure, and press on. The Syrian campaign and retreat. Facing rebellion in Cairo, Napoleon brutally suppressed an uprising before turning his attention to the Ottoman threat in Syria. The march across deserts to Gaza was marked by extreme hardship, brackish water, scant rations, and the consumption of dogs and camels for survival. At Jaffa, he crushed resistance, but at Acre, he met his match. After 2 months of futile siege efforts, he ordered a retreat on May 20, 1799. "I was stopped at Acre," he confessed. "My imagination died there. A glimpse of redemption and a return to France." Napoleon scored a final victory at Aboukir on July 11, 1799, but the strategic situation in Europe called him home. "If I can reach France, the rule of those babblers will be finished." Through a mix of audacity and fortune, he returned on October 9, 1799, determined to seize control of France's destiny. The decline of the Directory. Back in France, the Directory had descended into corruption and inefficiency. Leaders like Barras and Talleyrand enriched themselves while society languished in poverty. Taxes disappeared into the coffers of officials, leaving the populace disillusioned and the republic unstable. The Second Coalition, sensing France's vulnerability, launched a series of attacks that exposed the army's weakness and the government's incompetence. As cities like Milan fell, it became clear that the Directory could no longer lead. Public sentiment turned toward a savior, someone who could restore order and dignity. The 18th Brumaire, Napoleon takes charge. On November 9, 1799, Napoleon made his move. Sieyes, seeking a strongman to implement his vision, enlisted Napoleon, believing he could be controlled, but Napoleon had no intention of being anyone's pawn. Under the pretense of protecting the Republic, he marched on the Tuileries, accompanied by loyal troops. By the next day, the Directory was no more. France was now under the leadership of 3 provisional consuls, Napoleon, Sieyes, and Ducos, but it was clear who held the reins of power. "Tomorrow," Napoleon declared, "we shall sleep in Luxembourg." Chapter 6: Life under the Revolution. The New Classes. The French Revolution reshaped society with dramatic force, a fundamental redistribution of power, land, and economic control. The peasants. By 1793, the peasants, once tied to the land as mere laborers, had become landowners, controlling nearly half of France's soil. This shift was earned through the purchase of confiscated church properties, often at discounted rates. They built better homes, worked harder, and became defenders of the revolution. These small landowners sacrificed greatly, providing Napoleon with sons for his army for 15 years. Yet, their focus on traditional farming left them vulnerable to the rapid industrial and military advances of others. Inheritance reforms requiring equal division of property among all children, legitimate or not, also played a role. While it seemed fair, it fragmented wealth over generations, making it nearly impossible to amass dominance or sustained economic power. The proletariat. For the landless workers, miners, city laborers, the revolution brought no relief. Poverty persisted, and unions were outlawed, stripping them of a means to collectively fight for better conditions. Though they extracted the resources that fueled industries and warfare, their labor went largely unrewarded. By 1799, disillusioned and impoverished, they were ready to accept any leader who could promise order. Enter Napoleon. The bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, meanwhile, thrived by leveraging wealth and education. They acquired confiscated lands, controlled state finances through loans, and skillfully navigated political waters. However, their focus on trade over industry left France vulnerable to industrialized rivals. They knew the art of patience, retreating during authoritarian periods and biding their time until the pendulum of power swung back in their favor. The aristocracy. Stripped of power, many aristocrats fled, while others perished for their allegiances. Some embraced the revolution, others dreamt of restoring the monarchy, believing it the only path to stability. Their failure to adapt left them relics of a bygone era, eclipsed by the emerging social order. Religion. The revolution struck a devastating blow to the church. Lands were seized, clergy arrested, even the church bells were melted down. Yet, the roots of faith proved resilient. People still attended Mass, if only out of habit or a cautious hedge against eternal damnation. Secular morality was introduced, an attempt to replace religious authority with a system rooted in humanistic ideals, a project that continued long after the revolution. The new morality. The old moral codes collapsed, but new principles struggled to fill the void. Human behavior, as always, followed its own instincts. Morality and law. Freed from divine dictates, society turned inward and greed was rampant. A concept of public service emerged, inspired by the virtues of ancient Greece and Rome. Yet, these ideals were used to justify violence and power grabs. Public executions became so routine that people barely looked up from their work as heads rolled by. Sexual morality. With the fall of traditional constraints, sexual freedom brought promiscuity, disease, and illegitimate births. Figures like the Marquis de Sade promoted hedonism, while same-sex relationships and rampant prostitution gained visibility. Marriage became a simple declaration, further destabilizing family structures. Napoleon eventually reined in these freedoms, prioritizing stability over indulgence. Chapter 7. The Consulate. The rise of the Consulate and its challenges. The French Revolution left France fractured, desperate for stability. In 1799, with the Directory faltering, Napoleon Bonaparte, XIII, and Roger Ducal stepped forward as provisional consuls. Napoleon promised peace and stability, signaling a shift by exchanging his military uniform for civilian attire, sweeping reforms for stability. One of his earliest acts was easing the tax burden on common people, alleviating a 20 to 30% income tax. He worked to mend religious divisions and welcomed exiles back to rebuild trust in the nation. A Prussian ambassador noted an awakening spirit across France, while markets surged in response. The Constitution of the year VIII, power redefined. XIII, a revolutionary architect, argued for a structured, top-down approach to governance. The new constitution embodied the idea: confidence comes from below, power from above. Napoleon adapted XIII's design, placing himself as first consul, ensuring his authority was absolute. Under this system, the Council of State generated ideas, tribunes debated them, and the legislature voted, streamlining governance. Napoleon's appointees were capable and loyal, helping him achieve stability. He valued diverse opinions but always kept the final word, steering decisions towards his vision for France. An engine of bureaucratic efficiency, Napoleon prioritized talent over ideology when assembling his government. He appointed ministers from varying political backgrounds, focused solely on their ability to perform. Laplace, a mathematician, was briefly a minister before being reassigned to a more fitting role. Corruption was tackled through centralization. Prefects, sub-prefects, and mayors were appointed directly by the state to ensure accountability. By creating a structured hierarchy, Napoleon laid the groundwork for a lasting administrative legacy, criticism, and legitimacy. Not everyone supported these changes. Critics on the left and right decried the concentration of power, but Napoleon stayed the course. He effectively used media, such as the Moniteur newspaper, to counter opposition and shape public opinion. The public, weary of instability, largely embraced his rule. A plebiscite overwhelmingly affirmed Napoleon's leadership. With over 3 million votes in favor, the people chose action over endless debate, rallying behind the stability Napoleon offered. The Napoleonic Code, a legacy of law. One of Napoleon's crowning achievements was the Napoleonic Code. It standardized France's fragmented legal system, ensuring fairness and predictability under the law. Napoleon personally presided over 35 meetings during its creation, refining every detail. Faith and governance. Napoleon understood the importance of religion in maintaining order. He brokered a concordat with the Catholic Church, balancing state control with religious practice. Through this alliance, he secured support from both the devout and the secular, strengthening national unity. The march toward empire. As royalist plots and internal dissent continued, Napoleon moved to secure his power permanently. In 1802, a plebiscite granted him a lifetime consulship, supported by millions of votes. This marked the beginning of his transformation from revolutionary leader to imperial ruler. By 1804, the Senate declared Napoleon emperor, with the support of the people and the church. France had transitioned from revolution to empire, cementing Napoleon's place in history. Chapter 8: The New Empire. The coronation, December 2, 1804. Napoleon ascended to imperial power with a calculated ease. He stopped calling the French citizens, replacing it with "my subjects." In a striking move, he reinstated Fouché, the man who had once voted for Louis XVI's execution, into his service. Upon gaining Fouché's loyalty, the minister declared, "It was the first service I had the occasion to perform for your majesty." This exchange symbolized the intricate balance of power Napoleon mastered. Seeking legitimacy, Napoleon looked to the medieval traditions of papal anointment. He summoned the Pope to Paris, merging divine blessing with his earthly ambitions. The coronation, a grand event, was orchestrated like a military campaign. Every detail, from the regalia to the poets, bore Napoleon's meticulous touch. On the day itself, before a crowd of thousands, Napoleon crowned himself. It was a bold declaration. His authority was self-made, not bestowed by another. Josephine knelt before him, receiving her own crown of diamonds. The Pope, a witness to this act of sovereignty, proclaimed, "Vivat Imperator in aeternum." Napoleon's oath. "I swear to maintain the territory of the Republic, to uphold equality and liberty, and to govern only for the happiness and glory of the French people." The Third Coalition, 1805. Despite seeking peace, Napoleon's overtures to England were met with rejection. George III dismissed Napoleon's conciliatory letter, opting instead for continued opposition. England rallied vulnerable nations to its cause. Alexander of Russia, torn between peacekeeping and conquest, sought dominance in Turkey and Egypt. Russia allied with England, signing a treaty that exchanged military support for substantial subsidies. Austria joined this coalition, determined to counter Napoleon's growing empire. Thus, the Third Coalition was born, an alliance united by fear of a single man. Austerlitz, December 2, 1805. Napoleon prepared for this challenge with strategic brilliance. He positioned his armies aiming for a decisive blow. While one army faced Austria and Italy, his Grande Armée advanced swiftly toward Vienna. In a stunning campaign, Napoleon captured 30,000 Austrians near Ulm, and Vienna fell without resistance. However, news of Nelson's victory at Trafalgar reminded Napoleon of his limits at sea. Turning back to land, he prepared for a defining confrontation with the coalition. At Austerlitz, Napoleon addressed his troops. "The enemy marches to my right but presents their flank to me. Victory must be ours today." By the end, 20,000 prisoners and 15,000 dead lay testament to his genius. He promised his men, "Say you were at Austerlitz and they will call you heroes." The Mapmaker, 1806–07. Upon hearing of Austerlitz, Britain's William Pitt lamented, "Roll up that map of Europe, it will not be needed for 10 years. Napoleon, now master of the continent, redrew borders to reflect his dominance. Austria ceded vast territories, while Napoleon's Confederation of the Rhine dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. Francis II renounced his title, becoming Francis I of Austria, as an old order crumbled. Napoleon's vision extended beyond conquest. He declared, "To perfect administration is the true glory." Jena, Eylau, Friedland, 1806-07. Prussia, emboldened by alliances with Russia and England, challenged Napoleon. The Queen called him a monster, urging resistance, but Prussia was ill-prepared for his wrath. At Jena, Napoleon annihilated the Prussian army in a single day. Berlin fell soon after, and Napoleon declared an economic blockade of Britain, the continental system. In Poland, Napoleon was greeted as a liberator. Amid adoration, he took Countess Marie Walewska as his mistress, blending diplomacy with personal allure. At Friedland, Napoleon crushed the Russian forces, leaving 25,000 dead. Defeated and demoralized, Russia sought peace, marking another resounding victory for the emperor. Tilsit, June 25 to July 9, 1807. Napoleon and Alexander met on a raft in the middle of a river, a scene rich with symbolism. They embraced, forging a friendship between two monarchs of Europe. The treaty divided influence. Napoleon dominated the West, Alexander the East. Chapter 9. The Mortal Realm. The Bonapartes. Napoleon Bonaparte, the architect of an empire sprawling across Europe, faced his greatest challenge not in conquest but in governance. He believed his family, bound by blood, would share his vision and safeguard his legacy. The Bonapartes proved to be a patchwork of ambition, ineptitude, and self-interest. Their collective failures revealed the danger of relying on kin for loyalty, as familial bonds unraveled under the weight of responsibility. Joseph, the eldest brother, lacked the fire of leadership. Though well-meaning, his thirst for wealth overshadowed his ability to inspire respect or fear. Lucien, volatile and undisciplined, offered fleeting moments of support, driven more by personal gain than duty. Louis, with a kind heart ill-suited for empire, prioritized the welfare of his subjects over imperial obligations, an unforgivable weakness in Napoleon's eyes. Jerome embodied youthful recklessness, squandering opportunities until his fleeting redemption at Waterloo. Amid this chaos, one exception stood tall: Eugene de Beauharnais. As Viceroy of Italy, he emulated Napoleon's discipline, proving that merit, not blood, breeds greatness. The women of the family also played complex roles. In the end, Napoleon's elevation of his family became his Achilles' heel, as he lamented, "If I made a brother of mine a king, he at once thought himself king by the grace of God." A dynasty built on nepotism fractured under its own weight, squandering what the emperor had so meticulously constructed. The Peninsular War. Napoleon's ambitions in the Iberian Peninsula ignited a conflict that bled his empire dry. Driven by a desire to control Portuguese-English trade, he miscalculated, unleashing a torrent of resistance. In Spain, his attempt to mediate royal disputes spiraled into chaos, fueling revolts. Joseph Bonaparte's imposition as king was met with widespread disdain, further alienating the Spanish people. The French suffered a humiliating defeat at Bailen, shattering the myth of their invincibility. In Portugal, Wellesley's victory against Junot showed the world that France could be challenged and beaten. The Peninsular War became a testament to Napoleon's overreach. Every misstep weakened the empire. Constellation at Erfurt. Amid rising tensions, Napoleon sought to solidify his alliance with Russia through the grandeur of the Erfurt Assembly. Lavish displays and contrived camaraderie masked the fragile nature of this alliance. While Napoleon wooed Tsar Alexander with theatrics, his own minister, Talleyrand, secretly undermined him. Renewed struggle in Spain. Napoleon returned to Spain determined to crush resistance, his drive propelling his forces through brutal campaigns. In Madrid, he enacted reforms to dismantle feudalism, alienating both supporters and detractors. As British forces, led by Moore, outmaneuvered him, the campaign devolved into a grueling pursuit. The retreat marked another fruitless endeavor, each step forward met with mounting resistance and dwindling resources. Fouché, Talleyrand, and Austria, enemies within and without. While Napoleon waged war abroad, dissent festered at home. Fouché and Talleyrand conspired, seeking to replace the emperor. Austria seized the moment, declaring war against a distracted and weakened France. Napoleon rallied, securing a costly victory but exposing the cracks in his empire's foundation. Marriage and politics. To cement his dynasty, Napoleon ended his marriage to Josephine, prioritizing an heir over personal affection. His union with Marie-Louise of Austria symbolized a political triumph. The birth of his son seemed to secure his vision of a lasting legacy. Chapter 10. Napoleon himself. Body. Let us begin with the body, for in it lies the foundation of all endeavors. Napoleon's youth bore the inevitable scars of time and the crushing weight of command. By his 40s, he had grown heavier, his slight paunch a perch for his hand in moments of thought. His habits, like clasping his hands behind his back, hinted at the complex creature he had become. Though short for a military leader, about 5 feet 6 inches, his stature was irrelevant. The fire of his gaze carried an authority that surpassed any height, as General Van Damme confessed. That devil of a man exercises upon me a fascination that I cannot explain. Though I fear neither God nor devil, I tremble like a child in his presence. This was not mere charisma. It was raw, unrelenting force, the kind that bends even the strongest wills. Napoleon's simplicity defined his style, a gray coat, minimal adornment, and no extravagance. He dressed as a machine of war, his appearance an extension of his singular purpose. Beneath this simplicity, however, his body bore the toll of his campaigns. Itching skin and aching muscles led him to hours in hot baths. His eating and drinking were restrained, his body a carefully tuned engine. Mistrusting doctors, he preferred self-reliance, proclaiming, "Our body is a machine for life. Let it take care of itself. It will do better than if you paralyze it with medicine." Such a belief underscored his determination to maintain control over his health, his body, and his destiny. His ambitions pressed not only himself but those around him to their limits. Men collapsed under the weight of his work ethic. He saw no place for weakness. A Parisian official once lamented, "He has already killed Portelis, Cretet, and nearly Trielhart. They could no longer urinate, nor the others either." Napoleon demanded everything, sparing no one in his relentless pursuit of greatness, that he worked ceaselessly, living by the clock. As he once confided, "I am always working. I work while dining, at the theater, in the middle of the night." He also mastered the balance of work and rest, capable of switching his mind off as needed, a discipline few could emulate. The intellect. But his genius was not mystical. It was built through disciplined observation, logical thought, and controlled aggression. For Napoleon, intellect was not idle contemplation but a tool to reshape reality. He demanded actionable knowledge, instructing his aides to focus on definite objectives, factual information, and practical measures. He was a strategist, not a dreamer. "If I seem ready for the moment," he said, "it is because I have thought it through long before. My actions are not the result of sudden inspiration but of reflection." Preparation was his strength, allowing him to anticipate every eventuality. Even in fear he found strength, admitting, "When I plan a battle, I am the most fearful of men. I magnify all possible evils. Bad news was met with urgency. Do not wake me for good news. But bad news, rouse me instantly, for then there is not a moment to lose." People, to Napoleon, were puzzles to solve and tools to wield. He studied their motivations, exploiting ambition, fear, vanity, or weakness. Trust was a luxury he did not afford others, yet devotion followed him, a paradox of his nature. His mistakes, too, remind us of his humanity. Decisions regarding Josephine or Alexander reveal the cracks even in great minds. He admitted, "I was never my own master. I was always governed by circumstance." And yet, within these admissions lay an unrelenting drive to rise above. "Imagination rules the world," he declared. The character. Pride was his compass, driving him from Corsican obscurity to the heights of empire. His ego grew with each conquest, swelling to encompass the nation itself. He believed power was his destiny, declaring, "I love power as a musician loves his violin." For him, glory was life's true currency, its pursuit relentless and all-consuming. His temper was as fiery as his ambition. Quick to anger, he wielded his mood strategically, keeping allies and enemies alike off balance. Despite his outbursts, he could be kind, playful, and even humorous, though these traits faded with time. Love and friendship held little place in his life. He dismissed them as distractions, reserving genuine affection only for his son, born of both ambition and legacy. "Friendship is but a name," he admitted. "I love nobody. Perhaps Joseph a little, and Duroc, but true friends? None." The general. From his education at Brienne to the battlefields of Europe, Napoleon honed the art of war into a science. "The art of war," he said, "is an immense study which comprises all others." He studied the greats, Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, and surpassed them. He connected with his soldiers, creating a bond rooted in respect and morale. Morale and opinion are more than half the battle. Speed and momentum defined his tactics, exploiting every weakness to shatter the enemy's will. On the battlefield, he found his true self. "My power depends upon my glory, and my glory on my victories." His hunger for conquest became his undoing. In the end, the same force that built his empire led to its collapse. "My forte became my fate." The ruler. To rule, Napoleon approached governance as a general conducting a campaign, decisive, relentless, and strategic. "From my first entrance into public life, I was accustomed to exercise command." He acknowledged no master and obeyed only laws of his own making. For Napoleon, power without absolute control was meaningless. Thus, the shift from republic to monarchy became inevitable, justified by his belief: to govern, it is necessary to be a military man. One can rule only in boots and spurs. Efficiency and complete command were the hallmarks of his rule. In just 955 of the 3,680 days of his imperial reign spent in Paris, Napoleon managed to remake France. His relentless work ethic made it impossible to rest, even as the weight of his empire grew. Order was his cornerstone, demanding precision and readiness from his aides. They were judged by the timeliness, accuracy, and clarity of their reports, for he left no detail unexamined. Each day he reviewed memoranda and documents, unwilling to leave even minor matters unattended. Napoleon delegated authority, but only so far. He favored second-tier men, those who would not challenge his decisions or propose alternatives. He had no patience for prolonged debates, demanding loyalty and results. I aroused emulation, rewarded merit, and pushed back the limits of glory. Under him, talent was elevated, but loyalty was paramount. Pragmatism defined his administration. He exploited flaws in his subordinates, leveraging their ambitions or indiscretions to ensure obedience. A statesman's heart must be in his head, he believed. I like only those people who are useful to me, and only so long as they are useful. In law, as in governance, Napoleon prioritized effectiveness over ideals. The art of policing consists in punishing rarely and severely. He sought a surveillance state, suspecting everything to maintain control. This created a structured society where perception and order were paramount. He understood the value of a reputation for sternness. They think I am stern, even hard-hearted, so much the better. This prevents disorder. Napoleon's reforms aimed at meritocracy, proclaiming a career open to talents. He removed barriers of lineage, yet his ambition often overreached. His vision of a unified Europe with common laws, currency, and trade collapsed under the weight of national identities. The philosopher. Napoleon's mind was sharp, critical, and firmly grounded in reality. He dismissed abstract philosophy, preferring tangible results. My son should study much history, he advised, for it is the only true philosophy. Religion, in Napoleon's eyes, was less a matter of faith and more a tool of governance. While he acknowledged the mysteries of creation, he found organized religion to be a construct of man. It comforted the poor and restrained chaos. Religion introduces into thought an idea of equalization, which saves the rich from being massacred by the poor. Thus, he restored the Catholic Church, not out of piety, but to harness its stabilizing power. Marriage, too, was framed as a practical institution, devoid of romanticism, that he insisted on structure and control in relationships, reflecting his broader philosophy of societal governance. Napoleon saw humanity through a lens of utility. Men were reasoning animals, and women were relegated to roles of belief and stability. "We treat women too well," he opined, arguing against equality and favoring traditional hierarchies. Education for women, he believed, should emphasize religion and obedience, reinforcing their societal roles. In politics, he understood the inevitability of inequality. Democracy should limit itself to giving everyone an equal opportunity to compete. Revolutions, while agents of change, were also destructive forces requiring strong leadership to stabilize their aftermath. Napoleon's ultimate vision was a unified Europe under his control. But even he recognized the limitations of power, admitting, "The greater one is, the less free will one can have." In the end, he saw immortality only in legacy. To have lived without glory, without leaving a trace of one's existence, is not to have lived at all. What was he? Was Napoleon French, Corsican, a son of the Revolution? He transcended simple definitions, embodying a rare amalgam of ambition, intellect, and circumstance. He viewed France as an instrument, like a violinist loves his violin. While he rose from revolutionary ideals, he reversed many of their principles. He ended the revolution shaping its energy into an empire, according to Will Durant. He was Corsican in blood, French in education, and Italian in almost everything else. Ultimately, Napoleon was a force of nature, a Renaissance mind in the guise of a modern ruler. Artist and warrior, philosopher and despot, he was a singular figure who shaped the world, yet succumbed to the flaws of his humanity. Will Durant writes, "He was as great as a man can be without virtue, and he was as wise as a man can be without modesty." Nevertheless, he remained within the bounds of probability when he predicted that the world would not see the likes of him for many centuries. Chapter 11. Napoleonic France. The economy. Napoleon understood that the true foundation of any great nation was its economy, as Will Durant aptly put it. Finances founded upon a good system of agriculture never fail. Napoleon embraced this truth, forging a nation where economic strength equaled military might. He promoted free enterprise, competition, and private ownership, shunning the illusions of collectivism. Napoleon believed that hunger made the world move. Ambition, in his eyes, required reward, and without it, society would stagnate. He prioritized farmers, shielding them with protective tariffs and paving the way for productivity through roads and canals. These investments not only fed the nation but also powered his armies. Through monumental construction projects, he created jobs and unified France. Over 33,000 miles of roads, new bridges, and improved Parisian streets beautified and connected the nation. Though worker unions were banned, wages outpaced living costs. Durant noted that the proletariat became more patriotic than the bourgeoisie. Napoleon rejected utopian ideals of collectivism, seeing them as contrary to human nature. He believed, as Durant summarized, that the abler minority will soon govern the majority. While the Continental blockade disrupted ports and angered merchants, it empowered small businesses. Street shops thrived amidst the trade restrictions. Napoleon financed his wars through conquest and clever management of resources. He reduced taxes, allowing peasants to retain 70% of their earnings, a dramatic improvement from pre-revolution days. The reorganization of the Bank of France provided stability, launching a long legacy of economic service. Under Napoleon's deliberate leadership, France experienced unprecedented prosperity. As the Comte de Montalivet reflected, this success stemmed from the suppression of feudalism, the equal distribution of wealth, and the simplification of laws. The teachers. Napoleon admired the Jesuit structure and implemented a similar hierarchical approach in education. Every manager and teacher adhered to a preset model, ensuring consistency. The Imperial University. This institution oversaw education through teacher training colleges, emphasizing order and uniformity. Promotions required merit, aligning with Napoleon's demand for excellence. École normale. By 1813, college educators were required to be graduates of this rigorous, science-focused institution. Napoleon instilled military discipline in learning. Intellectuals who thrived on abstract theories were dismissed by Napoleon as impractical dreamers. He believed real progress came from action, not endless debate. Institut National. He restructured this think tank to prioritize science, literature, and art over fruitless ideological musings. Under his reign, French scholarship was to lead Europe for decades. The warriors. France's strength under Napoleon was not just in numbers, it was in spirit. The revolution's system of drafting men aged 20 to 25 swelled France's armies to 2.6 million soldiers. Despite the hardships and losses, this system ensured a constant supply of manpower. Napoleon inspired his soldiers with dreams of glory. Through uniforms, ranks, and the elite Imperial Guard, he fueled ambition and a sense of belonging. As Durant observed, Napoleon's wars expanded the scale of conflict and shattered traditional rules of engagement. War justifies everything, Napoleon declared. Victory wasn't just a goal, it was a national obsession. Durant described a France where there were no more old men, only corpses or demigods. Napoleon turned ordinary men into symbols of pride and resilience. While corruption lingered among some generals, the heart of Napoleon's military legacy lay in its discipline and ambition. Morals and manners. Post-revolution, France teetered on the edge of chaos. Napoleon stepped in to restore order, molding society to align with his vision. He curbed immorality, enforcing modesty in dress and decorum. When confronted by a revealing gown, he quipped, "I presume you nurse your children yourself." Napoleon's legal codes reinforced family hierarchies, where husbands held authority. Durant noted that the family resumed its function of turning animals into citizens. He reintroduced nobility with the Legion of Honor and imperial titles, rewarding merit in service. With each title came prestige, revenue, and elaborate uniforms. Though Napoleon dismissed etiquette as the prison of kings, he understood its value for governance. Display is to power what ceremony is to religion, Durant observed. The Jews in France. Napoleon's France was groundbreaking in granting civil rights to Jews. Jews gained liberties, but economic success led to tensions, particularly in areas like Alsace. Napoleon convened Jewish leaders to reconcile their faith with French laws, fostering integration. Though progress was uneven, Napoleon's actions marked a turning point for Jewish equality in Europe. Chapter 12. Napoleon and the Arts. Napoleon Bonaparte, a man consumed with the weight of empire building, had little time for music. Still, he occasionally attended the opera, fulfilling a ruler's duty to meditate and be seen, as Durant put it. Napoleon favored Italian operas, drawn to their melodious arias and dramatic plots. Even as he indulged, he lamented that Paris lacked an opera house worthy of its high claims. Napoleon acknowledged talent, but his focus on utility often left true artistry unrewarded. Art, for Napoleon, was never just decoration. It was strategy, using it to project France's glory and immortalize himself. From 1796 to 1814, Napoleon sent 506 works of art from Italy to France. Under his orders, museums were established to project French supremacy. Chapter 13. Literature versus Napoleon. The Censor. Napoleon Bonaparte had little patience for economists and political theorists, dismissing them as phrasemongers. What mattered to him was clear: a centralized government, economic strength, and the supremacy of France. Anyone who obstructed these ambitions faced silencing, either through patronage or outright suppression. In 1802, he proclaimed, unlimited freedom of the press would very soon re-establish anarchy in a country where all the elements for such a condition are already present. To Napoleon, order was non-negotiable. Even private correspondence was not spared. Postmasters intercepted and inspected mail for dissent, keeping Napoleon informed with daily summaries of newspapers, books, and even sermons. He understood the power of words and moved swiftly against opposition. Of 73 newspapers in France, he suppressed 60, leaving only Le Moniteur as his controlled voice. He didn't just oversee it, he contributed to its content. In theater, he wielded similar control, believing the stage amplified ideas with explosive potential. Plays critical of his government were swiftly banned, and all literature required official approval before printing. Napoleon compared authors addressing the public to speakers addressing a political assembly. Both needed regulation. Writers and publishers conformed or faced severe consequences. Under this climate of repression, only the bravest dared resist his control. Madame de Staël, Napoleon's adversary. Germaine de Staël returned to Paris to influence the political destiny of France. Wealthy, independent, and intellectually fierce, she liked the idea of a constitutional monarchy. Remarkably, she united both royalists and Jacobins in her cause, using her sharp wit and charisma to draw people to her salon. Napoleon once described her as full of arrows, an adversary who desired nothing less than his defeat. De Staël inspired people to think, act, and challenge the status quo. Though her father believed in dictatorship during crises, she insisted freedom was a higher good. Her principles fueled her relentless struggle against Napoleon's regime. The author. Her resistance found powerful expression in her writings. In de la littérature, she advocated for freedom, progress, and enlightenment, concepts at odds with Napoleon's authoritarian rule. Napoleon, recognizing her intellectual influence, banned her works and banished her from Paris. She sought refuge in Germany. Understanding Germany. De Staël believed that to understand an adversary, one must study their strengths. Her masterpiece, the L'Allemagne, on Germany, was both an exploration and a celebration of German culture. She described everyday life with vivid detail, but also noted the stark divisions in German society. While she admired German universities and philosophy, she struggled with the language's complexity, imperfect triumph. Despite her achievements, de Staël often felt isolated and weary from her battles. With Napoleon's fall, she returned to France, advocating for democratic reforms until her final days. Even as her health waned, she insisted on a national assembly elected by the people. Napoleon himself admitted, she was the greatest woman of her time. Chapter 14, Science and Philosophy. Mathematics and Physics. Will Durant observed that Napoleon was the first modern ruler with a scientific education. Educated by Franciscan friars, Napoleon studied mathematics, physics, and chemistry. In Napoleon's France, pure science flourished. Intellectuals like Lagrange, Legendre, and Laplace pioneered the advancements. Loyalty to this vision ran deep. Gaspard Monge, one of Napoleon's trusted scientists, was defended by the students of l'École Polytechnique, even as political tides turned against him. Joseph Fourier created the Fourier series. Gay-Lussac flew 23,000 feet in a balloon to better understand atmospheric phenomena. Laplace produced the mechanical theory of the universe. He believed the cosmos operated like a vast machine, bound to the laws of Newton and his own calculations. When Napoleon asked where God fit into his theories, Laplace replied, "I have no need of that hypothesis." Yet even he acknowledged the limits of human understanding, confessing, "That which we know is a little thing, that which we do not know is immense." The case for conservatism. The chaos of revolution left many seeking stability. Conservatives argued for a return to tradition, faith, and hierarchy. Vicomte de Bonald advocated for absolute monarchy and patriarchal authority, viewing them as ordained by God to restore order. Joseph de Maistre, a defender of the Catholic Church, decried the Enlightenment as a moral disaster. For Maistre, tradition was sacred. Nations have never been civilized except by religion, he declared. Only the fear of an all-seeing God could restrain humanity's darker impulses. He mocked the rationalists, insisting that history's lessons were more valuable than the shallow wisdom of self-proclaimed intellectuals. Monarchy, he believed, was the most enduring form of government, a steady hand to guide the ship of state through turbulent seas. Chapter 15. England at Work. A different kind of revolution. The revolution that swept through England was unlike the fiery upheaval in France. Where the guillotine fell and cries of égalité echoed, England's transformation was quieter but no less profound. It was a revolution of construction, not destruction. At its heart was a singular principle, the pursuit of individual power and possessions. Even the mist and rain of England seemed to shape their character. They saw opportunity in their geography, harnessing rivers and coastlines to build ships. These ships became tools of exploration and dominion. The English claimed the seas as their own. The Industrial Revolution, a triumph of calculation and relentless effort, was their crowning achievement. Even their challenges were turned to their advantage. When small farms were consolidated, more labor was compelled into factories, creating the engines of industrial growth. Tradition held little sway over them. What were traditions after all but relics of past errors? Iron and coal fueled their factories, while ambition drove them forward. Rural folk flocked to cities, seeking their fortunes amidst the chaos and innovation of this new age. Cities swelled, transforming from small towns into industrial powerhouses in mere decades. Railways stretched across the landscape, roads expanded, and ships grew faster and stronger. This was not just the birth of a new economy, it was the birth of a new England. At the bottom, the workers who powered this revolution endured unimaginable hardships. 12 to 14-hour days were the norm, and children labored alongside adults. Their small hands were useful for the machinery, and sentimentality had no place in this system. Women were often preferred for their lower wages, and orphanages became sources of cheap labor. Survival was brutal, but it was survival nonetheless. Workhouses offered meager assistance, but even these were rife with abuse. The living conditions were deplorable, often worse than those afforded to animals. Discontent became the seed of ambition and change. Movements of resistance, like those led by Ned Ludd, sought to disrupt this system. Such efforts were swiftly suppressed by Parliament, backed by military force. The dismal science. Economists of the time were hardly sympathetic. Thomas Malthus warned that higher wages would only lead to more mouths to feed and deeper poverty. David Ricardo echoed this with his grim iron law of wages, suggesting earnings would always hover at subsistence levels. Robert Owen. Among these figures emerged Robert Owen, a man who saw a different path. Owen believed in combining capitalism with ethics, suggesting that success didn't require cruelty. At his mill in New Lanark, he raised wages, abolished child labor, and provided affordable food for workers. He established institutions focused on moral education, teaching values over rote knowledge. While his utopian experiments ultimately failed, Owen's legacy endured. He showed that progress could be humane, and his ideas influenced generations to come. Chapter 16. English Life. Classes. The social structure of Britain was like a layered cake. Its divisions were visible, stark, and undeniable. Wealth was the key determinant of status, with lords presiding over vast estates, amassing riches while peasants struggled to survive. The nobility, wrapped in the grandeur of titles like princes of the blood, wielded supreme power. The bourgeoisie, a class of shopkeepers and industrialists, yearned for upward mobility but found the nobility a formidable barrier. Even Napoleon acknowledged the role of the aristocracy in maintaining order, declaring, "It would be a European disaster if the English aristocracy were to disappear, if it were handed over to a London mob." Some argued that inherited power cultivated obedience and respect among the masses, promoting public order. But beneath this seemingly stable hierarchy, a growing unrest threatened to shake the system to its core. Government. The British government was a strange beast, a mix of tradition and outdated laws masquerading as a constitution. This so-called constitution was not a single written document but a patchwork of old parliamentary acts and court decisions. The House of Lords, composed of hereditary elites, served as an obstacle to the ambitions of the rising bourgeoisie. The House of Commons, the supposed voice of change, operated on a system so outdated that only 245,000 out of 9 million people could vote. Voter intimidation was rampant, with landowners pressuring tenants to align with their interests. Parliament held true power, controlling public funds, though the king retained some influence by appealing to public opinion. Even George III understood that he was ultimately answerable to Parliament. Judiciary. The judiciary was a maze of ancient laws and loopholes, more theatrical than just. Lawyers boasted that there was not a single statute through which they could not drive a coach and six. Trials resembled elaborate performances, with barristers vying for dominance in court. Judges rose from the ranks of crown-appointed barristers, while juries, requiring unanimity, decided verdicts. Wealthy landowners often served as justices of the peace, meting out punishments that reflected their own biases. In this chaotic system, fairness was often secondary to spectacle. Executive. Theoretically, the king held executive power, but in practice it rested with a cabinet accountable to Parliament. The king's influence lay in his ability to sway public opinion, a tool George III wielded. Though diminished by parliamentary authority, George III worked within the system, a monarch bound by the very laws that constrained him. Religion. Religion served as a tool of control, urging people to accept their place in the social order. The Anglican Church, led by the Crown, was deeply entrenched in the establishment, reinforcing the status quo. While Protestantism had a foothold, Catholicism and Judaism faced hostility, effectively sidelined from mainstream society. Yet amidst this rigidity, figures like William Wilberforce emerged, using faith as a force for change. Wilberforce denounced slavery as the most criminal action in history, sparking movements that would take decades to bear fruit. Education. Education reflected the chasm between classes, with the rich attending prestigious schools and the poor often left illiterate. The upper classes feared educating the poor, seeing it as a threat to their dominance. Religious schools offered basic instruction, but their focus was narrowly confined to Christian doctrine. By 1819, only a small fraction of children attended school, leaving 3/4 of the lower classes unable to read or write. For the elite, education emphasized classical studies, shaping eloquent speakers rather than critical thinkers. Morality. Hypocrisy ran deep among the upper classes, who indulged in excess while demanding virtue from the poor. Marriages were often calculated business arrangements, with love a secondary concern. Mary Wollstonecraft, an advocate for women's rights, exposed these hypocrisies in her seminal work on female liberation. She argued that women's lack of education kept them subservient, perpetuating a cycle of power and control. Social morality. Amid widespread corruption, gambling and drunkenness became pervasive escapes from reality. The rise in crime prompted harsh, often draconian punishments. Wilberforce sought moral renewal, urging societies to combat vice and promote humanitarian values. These efforts planted seeds of change, though the path to reform was long and fraught with resistance. Manners. Fashion reflected the times, with men in top hats and women in corsets embracing evolving modest styles. Social gatherings featured extravagant meals, copious drinking, and costly entertainments like horse races and intimate dances. Amid the chaos and contradictions of English life, there were glimmers of progress. Science advanced, philosophy deepened, and art captured the beauty of the English landscape. The nation stood at a crossroads, grappling with universal struggles of power, progress, and the pursuit of a better society. Chapter 17. The Arts in England. The Artists. Once, the term artist referred to anyone skilled in manual crafts. But by the 18th century, with the rise of industry, its meaning narrowed. Artist became a title reserved for musicians, painters, decorators, and architects, those considered geniuses. The word genius, tied to innate talent or divine inspiration, began to reflect extraordinary ability. As aristocratic patronage faded, artists turned to wealthy merchants for support. Some, like Lord Egremont, provided refuge, while others became financial backers, supporting figures like Wordsworth and Coleridge. Even King George III played a role, allocating £5,000 and offering space at Somerset House, paving the way for the Royal Academy of Art. This institution granted its 40 members honorary titles, elevating their social status, but leaving the titles non-hereditary. The wars of the era left many artists struggling to survive. Political caricature became a lifeline for some, mocking public figures like Napoleon with biting humor. Architecture. The architectural world grappled with a profound identity crisis. Classicism, with its elegant simplicity, clashed with the romantic drama of Gothic revival. Columns faced off against pointed arches in a symbolic battle of knights versus philosophers. Classicism often prevailed. William Chambers' Somerset House epitomized this style, likened to a Greek peristyle guarding a Roman palace. Yet, Gothic revival refused to fade. Horace Walpole's Strawberry Hill, built between 1748 and 1773, reignited interest in medieval grandeur. The Brighton Royal Pavilion, with its Hindu and Moorish-inspired splendor, cost an eye-watering £160,000. Despite criticism of its extravagance, Nash's work symbolized England's ability to produce opulence. Chapter 18. Science in England. The Progress of the Age. The advancements of the time were not merely handed down, they were seized. The individuals of this era recognized that success across all fields demanded fierce ambition and tireless endeavor. Industry and science cooperated to raise productivity and reduce costs, a natural, though unpremeditated, combination which was to create modern industrial capitalism and alter the character and distribution of political power. Count Rumford proved that mechanical work produces heat. Thomas Young established the wave theory of light. John Dalton in 1803 made chemistry truly scientific by establishing the atomic theory of matter and providing chemists with a system of mathematical relations. Dalton's theoretical work laid the foundation for modern chemistry. Humphrey Davy conducted experiments with chemistry and electricity. He also developed solutions to pressing challenges, such as the miner's lamp to prevent the frequent explosions of methane in coal mines. Erasmus Darwin, who was a philosophical poet and physician, formulated some preliminary theories of organic evolution, that organisms tend to adapt themselves to their environment and their acquired characteristics can be transmitted to the offspring. Dr. Edward Jenner published his inquiry into the cause and effects of the variolae vaccinae after successfully testing his treatment. He termed it vaccination, drawn from the Latin term vacca, meaning a cow. Chapter 19. English Philosophy. Thomas Paine on Christianity. Thomas Paine was no ordinary writer. Born in England, he journeyed to America, where his pamphlet Common Sense gained popularity. Later, he risked his life in France, attempting to save King Louis XVI from execution. Paine's Age of Reason wasn't born of hatred for religion. Instead, it reflected a pragmatic fear that morality and society itself might crumble if irrational beliefs were dismantled too abruptly. He warned, lest in the general wreck of superstition, false systems of government, and false theology, we lose sight of morality, of humanity, and of the theology that is true. Paine declared belief in a singular God, saying, "I believe in one God and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life." To Paine, biblical dogma was no more than ancient mythology adapted to serve power and revenue. He viewed Christ as a virtuous man, but rejected biblical tales as manipulative myths. Such fabrications, he argued, gave undue honor to Satan by distorting divine truth. For Paine, God was not a distant figure, but the essence of the universe itself, visible in nature and creation. Despite his intellect, Paine's later years were troubled. Addiction marred his final days, and many labeled his deism as veiled atheism. William Godwin on justice. William Godwin's inquiry concerning political justice sent shockwaves through intellectual circles. Hazlitt proclaimed, "Throw away your books of chemistry and read Godwin on necessity." A radical atheist, he dismissed religion and heaven as tools of control. He believed these constructs existed solely to enforce obedience and support governance. Godwin held that while heredity, experience, and circumstance shape our actions, they are no excuse for personal failure. For him, circumstances explained criminal acts, but he promoted rehabilitation over punishment. He argued for morality that binds the individual to the species, promoting collective well-being over individual gain. Godwin envisioned justice as conduct regulated for the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Yet, he also valued individual independence, warning against any system that excessively encroached on personal freedoms. Reform, he argued, must stem from education and gradual shifts in public opinion. He argued that violent overthrows of existing systems would likely harm society more than the inequalities they sought to erase. Godwin's revolution was one of ideas, not immediate action. Reason, he believed, wasn't a force unto itself but a tool to balance competing emotions and impulses. Thomas Malthus on population. Thomas Malthus challenged utopian visions with stark mathematical clarity. He observed that food supplies grow arithmetically, 1, 2, 3, 4, while populations, if unchecked, grow geometrically, 1, 2, 4, 8. This discrepancy, he argued, would lead to catastrophic imbalances. Unchecked population growth, he warned, would result in infanticide, disease, famine, and war. Such grim outcomes, he claimed, painfully balanced births with deaths. Malthus urged individuals to marry only when they could support a family. Chastity before marriage was essential to maintaining societal stability. Malthus framed his arguments within the immutable laws of supply and demand. Even Darwin found inspiration in Malthus, citing his ideas as foundational to the theory of natural selection. Chapter 20, Literature in Transition. The Press. Durant observed a fascinating tension in influence during this period. While France commanded political attention, England dominated the literary landscape. It was a question of enduring impact. France might stir the immediate clamor, but England shaped the deeper discourse. The literary output of the era rivaled that of Elizabethan England, though it was often the private letters of figures like Byron and Coleridge that captured attention. The newspapers, however, painted a different picture. Far from being havens of literary pursuit, they leaned into advertisements and political gossip, compressed into small sheets. Durant explained, the first and fourth of these were taken up by advertisements, the second went to politics. Editors and publishers, guided by the sway of public opinion, fought for dominance over the narrative. Certain publications, such as the Times and the Courier, amassed considerable influence. Yet, over the course of the 19th century, the press evolved into something far greater. It became, as Durant put it, an instrument, finally an indispensable constituent, of the rising democracy. Books. As literacy rates climbed, the book trade grew, transforming publishers into gatekeepers of talent and taste. Authors were often paid lump sums for manuscripts, effectively surrendering their creative labor to the publisher's commercial ambitions. Chapter 21. The Lake Poets. The Lake Poets were not a unified collective. What tied them together was not ideology, but geography, a shared love for England's Lake District. Durant described this region as one of the planet's most enchanting places, where mist and rain veiled mystic mountains, and evergreen foliage thrived amidst abundant flowers, their joy nurtured by the ever-present dew. It was a landscape that Wordsworth called home, from his childhood in Cockermouth to his residence in Grasmere. Coleridge found moments of solace in Keswick, and Southey eventually settled there for good. This setting, half Eden and half Muse, cradled the lives and imaginations of these poets, shaping their work and their shared history. Chapter 22. The Rebel Poets. The Tarnished Strain, 1066 to 1809. Our story begins not with a hero, but with a family lineage marked by chaos and scandal. The Byrons, descended from French ancestry, were a tempestuous clan, their history riddled with rebellion, intrigue, and infamy. One ancestor, nicknamed the Wicked Lord, killed a relative in a duel and landed in the Tower of London. Another, Mad Jack, fathered children from multiple mistresses, married a marchioness, and squandered his wealth. Among these children was Lord Byron's half-sister, who was rumored to be more than just family to him. Byron's mother, a fiery Scottish woman, only added to the drama of his early life. Reflecting on this heritage, Lord Byron once said, "I should have known what fruit would spring from such a seed." Even his physical deformity, a clubfoot, became less a curse and more a driving force, fueling a relentless need to conquer. Byron turned to the classics, believing they held a truth history could not, and in them he found himself. The Grand Tour, Byron, 1809 to 1811. Like many young men of his station, Byron left England to escape debts and societal expectations. With his servants in tow, he ventured eastward as Europe burned under the shadow of Napoleon. He walked the poverty-stricken streets of Lisbon, armed himself in Gibraltar, and wooed women in Malta. In Albania, he traveled alongside mercenaries, exploring wild landscapes. Finally, in Greece, he began Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, the poem that would immortalize him. Amidst ancient ruins and oppressed peoples, Byron found an echo of his own restless soul. The Lion of London, Byron. Returning to London, Byron became an overnight sensation. He mingled with the intellectual elite, Thomas More, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, and made waves with his outspoken views on war and industrial rebellion. The women of society were entranced by him. There's something softening in a woman's presence, he mused, even if one is not in love with her. Lady Caroline Lamb famously described him as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Byron refused payment for his work, his pride matching his talent. Entangled in affairs, including one with his half-sister Augusta Lee, Byron's life blurred the lines between filth and genius. Trial by marriage. Byron. Seeking stability, Byron married Annabella Milbank, though his heart was never truly in it. Their honeymoon was a disaster, their union cold and strained. Byron's affections wandered, to actors, to Augusta, and to the bottle. Annabella, alarmed by his erratic behavior, eventually fled. Rumors swirled of madness, cruelty, even sodomy. Byron, isolated and embittered, wrote poetry tinged with sorrow and regret. By 1816, scandal drove him into exile, leaving behind England and the ghosts of his marriage. The youth of Shelley. In contrast, Percy Bysshe Shelley emerged not from scandal but rebellion. He grew up questioning everything: religion, authority, society itself. At Oxford, he and his friend Hogg penned The Necessity of Atheism, an act that led to their expulsion. Shelley's fervent idealism, paired with his poetic gift, made him a figure of controversy. Drawn to Harriet Westbrook, a schoolmate of his sister, Shelley's romantic ideals met reality. They eloped, defying her family and societal norms. Their early years were tumultuous, filled with poverty, wanderings, and revolutionary dreams. In Queen Mab, Shelley envisioned a world free from tyranny, where reason and love could prevail. Contrasts. The differences between Byron and Shelley cannot be ignored. Byron had shed much of his earlier melancholy. His view of life had sharpened, becoming more grounded, more cynical. Power and wealth surrounded him, yet they did little to soothe his restless spirit. He believed in the lessons of history, that great men leave indelible marks on the world, but Byron was haunted by the possibility that his own might fade. Religion intrigued him, yet always eluded his grasp, leaving him teetering between faith and doubt. To the world, he presented a polished facade, concealing both his physical deformity and the storms of his soul. I am formed of two mighty tribes, the Boers and the Board. He longed for true love, not as a person, but as an ideal. He despised society's flaws, yet had no desire to fix them. Shelley, on the other hand, was equally complex, yet profoundly different. Where Byron was guarded, Shelley was open. Where Byron brooded, Shelley dreamed. He saw the world through rose-tinted glasses, often blind to its harsher realities. Shelley loved humanity in its entirety, treating all as equals, though his actions sometimes betrayed a quiet selfishness. He believed in the inherent goodness of people, even as loss and decay chipped away at his idealism. In his final years, he began to seek solace in religion, a surprising turn for a lifelong skeptic. Poets and philosophers are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Chapter 23, England's Neighbors, the Scots. Scotland entered a union with England in 1707, but the arrangement brought as much friction as it did opportunity. While the Scots gained access to trade and movement across Britain, their representation in the British Parliament was glaringly disproportionate. Worse still, Scottish representation was marred by corruption, with 15 of these delegates appointed by town councils that catered to the elite. The county of Bute, with 14,000 inhabitants, had just 21 voters. Across all of Scotland, only 2,400 voters determined the fate of millions, leaving power concentrated in the hands of the wealthy few. For most Scots, crushed under daily struggles, this inequity was endured in silence. Religion in Scotland was severe, shaped by fear rather than hope. The Sabbath was somber, defined by warnings of sin and eternal damnation. In some minds, even a young woman attending a dance was condemned. This grim theology, rooted in Calvinism, imposed a heavy moral weight on the people, and yet the Scots were progressive in unexpected ways. A robust system of public education stood out, requiring every parish to provide schooling for boys and girls. The Irish. Ireland, with its vibrant culture and resilient people, bore the heavy yoke of inequality in 1800. Catholics formed the overwhelming majority of the population, yet power rested in the hands of Protestant elites. This Protestant minority controlled Parliament, while Catholics were forced to choose among Protestant candidates to govern their land. The imbalance was stark. Catholics supported both their own clergy and the Protestant Church through taxes. Land ownership painted an even grimmer picture. Until 1793, every inch of Irish soil was held by Protestants, leaving most Catholics as impoverished tenants. The greatest landlords were often absentees, extracting wealth from Ireland without reinvesting in its growth. Industry was strangled by high tariffs, and poverty took root. Violence, too, stained Ireland's history. Protestant factions like the Orange Society clashed with Catholics, creating cycles of reprisal and fear. By 1801, Ireland's parliament dissolved, and British rule tightened its grip. Chapter 24. Pitt, Nelson, and Napoleon. Pitt and the Revolution. William Pitt, the second of his name, was a force to be reckoned with in British politics. Coming from a distinguished lineage and armed with a privileged education, he reached the Prime Minister's office at the tender age of 24. Pitt was astute, with a keen understanding of finance, and he aligned himself with Adam Smith's principles of free markets. Though he hailed from aristocracy, he took to the interests of the burgeoning merchant class. As the architect of British finance, he sought to establish the British Empire as a formidable power, initiating a debt repayment program that was sadly crippled by war. Pitt worked to curtail the abuses within rotten boroughs, despite having benefited from them during his own ascent. He became an advocate for freedom of the press and favored the abolition of the slave trade. Even after being humiliated by Napoleon, his foundational efforts prepared Britain for eventual victory. King George III, the reigning monarch, was a source of worry. His deteriorating mental state complicated the delicate balance of power between the crown and the government. Pitt's advice was often followed, but it was also interspersed with the king's unpredictable episodes. Initially, Pitt was not alarmed by the upheaval in France. He believed that France would resolve its internal chaos, allowing Britain to focus on its domestic issues. Later, he remarked that England could then work in peace while France disordered and reconstituted its political life. But this belief proved overly optimistic. Many Britons found themselves enraptured by the French Revolution, embracing the cause of inalienable rights. The third Earl of Stanhope even congratulated the National Assembly in France, hoping it would ignite similar aspirations for freedom worldwide. Yet, not everyone shared this enthusiasm. Revolution failed to ignite in Britain as it did in France for several reasons. The British Deist revolt had occurred much earlier, with the Anglican Church granting new freedoms. The middle class had adequate representation in Parliament, diminishing any urgency for an uprising. English citizens channeled their desire for change into nationalism, powering the military instead. Meanwhile, the French Revolution tumbled into violence, marked by mass killings as its forces turned against neighboring nations. In a chilling decree, the French government promised to aid others seeking liberation from tyranny, sending shockwaves through European monarchies. Fueled by territorial claims over Belgium, essential for Britain's economic interests, Pitt's government was further incensed. With the execution of Louis XVI, Britain declared war on France, stepping into a storm of conflict. Pitt formed a coalition aimed at undermining the revolution's influence, and dissent was met with intense government surveillance. Civil liberties were suspended, penalties imposed, revealing the panic among Britain's upper classes. Will Durant writes, "They found themselves faced by another revolution so soon after the costly revolt of the American colonies." Pitt's strategy leveraged Britain's financial might and formidable navy. He believed wealth was the key to victory, believing men could be bought for money. The nation's naval power was crucial for global dominance, led by one of history's greatest commanders, Nelson, 1758 to 1804. Horatio Nelson was a man seemingly born for the sea. Tracing his ancestry to East Anglian Vikings, he was a natural leader. He took command of the HMS Hinchinbrook at just 20 years old. He gave an arm, an eye, then his life for Britain, indulging in a pride as lofty as his monument. In his youth, Nelson nearly forsook his naval commission for a romantic pursuit, but thanks to a friend's intervention, he returned to duty. He wed Mrs. Frances Nisbet, but when war with France resumed, he departed for the sea. When tasked with capturing the port of Calvi in Corsica, Nelson sustained an injury that cost him his right eye. As Nelson maneuvered through the Mediterranean, he faced challenges from Napoleon's advancing forces. Napoleon's military prowess pushed British, Austrian, and Neapolitan troops into retreat. Yet, during the Battle of St. Vincent, Nelson commanded HMS Captain and defeated a Spanish armada of 27 ships. In subsequent engagements, Nelson suffered another blow, resulting in the amputation of his right arm. Despite the setback, he demanded a new assignment, leading him on a secret mission to track Napoleon's forces. Nelson journeyed from Gibraltar to Palermo. Finally, he cornered Napoleon at Aboukir near Alexandria and emerged victorious. Back in London, news of his triumph fueled Pitt's coalition efforts against Napoleon. Greeting Nelson with warmth, Lady Hamilton fainted in his arms, prompting bold declarations of his infatuation with her. Yet, amidst rising prestige, Nelson faced challenges. Tasked with protecting Naples, he chose love over duty, aligning himself with Lady Hamilton. Their scandal strained relationships, leading to further estrangement from his wife. Trafalgar, 1805. After Pitt's departure, the administration under Addington shifted strategy, seeking peace with Napoleon at great concessions. But when negotiations faltered, the burden of defeating the French Navy fell squarely onto Nelson's shoulders. Napoleon aimed for a full-scale invasion by amassing troops along the coasts of France. Pitt had formed a third coalition to push the French into a defensive stance. On October 21, 1805, Nelson led his fleet into the Battle of Trafalgar, commanding, "England expects that every man will do his duty." In a decisive offensive, his ships shattered enemy lines, facing little resistance amid poorly led forces. Sniper fire struck Nelson, making him an easy target due to his distinguished medals. His men rushed to carry him away from danger as victory was achieved. With his last wishes, he urged Captain Hardy to take care of my dear Lady Hamilton. Then came a serene moment. "Kiss me, Hardy. Now I am satisfied. Thank God, I have done my duty." The entire enemy fleet surrendered to Nelson, securing British naval supremacy for a century. The defeat crushed the French and Spanish admirals, leading some to despair and end their lives. France was ultimately defeated at Waterloo. Pitt celebrated Trafalgar but soon succumbed to sickness and exhaustion, dying at the age of 47. England marks time, 1806-12. Pitt's death ushered in political discord and instability. Incompetent politicians filled the void, prioritizing internal clashes over governance. Doubly tarnished by internal comedy and external tragedy, the Portland ministry resigned. Spencer Perceval's tenure as Prime Minister also witnessed missteps and failures. Heavy taxation strained the public, threatening the nation's economic viability. To make matters worse, Britain declared war on the United States. Ultimately, a disgruntled merchant took Perceval's life, paving the way for the Earl of Liverpool's coalition. This coalition would eventually lead Britain towards victories in subsequent conflicts. Meanwhile, Napoleon expanded his ambitions, marching his grand army towards Russia via the Niemen River. Chapter 25, Iberia. Portugal, 1789 to 1808. Portugal at the dawn of revolution, a country clinging to the stillness of its medieval past. The French Revolution sent shockwaves into a land untouched by modern currents. Shielded by the Pyrenees, Portugal remained a backwater, eyed hungrily by Spain and shackled by the Inquisition's oppressive grip. Its people were simple, unambitious, and led by a fragile monarchy. Queen Maria Francisca, with her feeble intellect, and her son John, both tethered tightly to the church and the throne. Yet, a faint spark flickered. There were students, Freemasons, scientists, and poets, dreamers of a Portugal unchained. They envisioned representative government, free trade, assembly, and a press unbound. For them, the French Revolution was a revelation, exhilarating for some, terrifying for others. Masonic lodges celebrated, while Portugal's foreign minister praised the fall of the Bastille. But the monarchy trembled as revolution deposed the King of France, prompting a furious crackdown on Portugal's liberals. Artists and poets were imprisoned, Manuel du Bocage jailed for a sonnet against despotism. Portugal, clinging to outdated systems, failed to harness its natural resources, stagnating in agriculture and industry. Napoleon saw opportunity in this weakened state. In 1807, he enlisted Spain in a bold invasion of Portugal, targeting its refusal to join his blockade of Britain. The Portuguese royal family fled aboard an English vessel, seeking sanctuary in Brazil. Napoleon's forces swept into Lisbon with ease. The House of Braganza ceased to reign. Spain, 1808. Spain, a nation steeped in the Middle Ages and content to remain there. A deeply devout land, its people thronged to cathedrals and sacred shrines, consumed by spiritual devotion. Illiteracy shadowed the masses, with printed charms against Satan sold openly in shops. Napoleon scorned Spanish peasants, calling them more isolated from European civilization than even the Russians. Yet there was a fierce pride among them. Byron spoke of their dignity, rivaling that of dukes. Amid this backwardness, Spain had its bright spots. Its art rivaled Italy's and the Dutch's, but politically, Spain was crumbling. Corruption festered, and patriotism waned. A degenerate monarchy ruled. Charles IV was a puppet to his wife Maria Luisa and her lover, Godoy. Prince Ferdinand betrayed his father, forcing his abdication, only to fall into Napoleon's trap. Seizing the chaos, Napoleon manipulated both Ferdinand and Charles, ultimately placing his brother Joseph on Spain's throne. Joseph tried to govern, but his agnostic reputation alienated Spain's devout masses. Rebellion flared, and Spain erupted into turmoil. Poets like Quintana and Gallego rallied Spaniards against the French. Yet some welcomed Napoleon, hoping his reforms would shatter Spain's feudal chains. The conflict became a crucible, tradition clashing with change, leaving Spain in chaos. Arthur Wellesley, 1769 to 1807. Enter Arthur Wellesley, not yet the Duke of Wellington. His beginnings were unremarkable, a student of middling performance, a violinist more than a soldier. Even his mother doubted his potential, calling him an awkward youth without direction. Yet, he found his calling in the military, where discipline and strategy ignited his talents. In India, he earned victories that solidified his reputation. By 1808, he was a rising star, tasked with leading 13,500 troops to drive the French from Portugal. Wellesley's strategic brilliance shone in his early campaigns. At Vimeru, he defeated Junot decisively, forcing the French into retreat. Though criticized for granting Junot leniency, Wellesley abhorred war's brutality. If you had seen but one day of war, you would pray to Almighty God that you might never again see an hour of it. The Peninsular War, 1808 to 1812. The Peninsular War tested nations and men alike. Joseph Bonaparte struggled to maintain control of Spain, his every move resisted by a defiant clergy and populace. The French armies, though vast, underestimated the Spanish spirit. Meanwhile, Arthur Wellesley, now a seasoned commander, saw opportunity where others despaired. He convinced Britain to commit more troops, promising victory through strategy and resolve. In 1809, he faced Marshal Soult, whose army threatened Oporto. Wellesley struck with precision, forcing Soult into a chaotic retreat. Victory followed victory as he outmaneuvered the French, earning the title of Viscount Wellington. By 1812, he marched into Spain, routing French forces at Salamanca and entering Madrid. Results: the Peninsular War reshaped Iberia. Portugal and Spain, once subjugated, reclaimed their sovereignty. Their colonies in South America seized the moment, declaring independence. Wellington proved that France could not dominate Iberia without sacrificing its empire. The resistance united peasantry and clergy, securing victories for tradition and faith. Politically, the juntas gained autonomy, drafting a constitution abolishing torture, slavery, and feudal privileges. Chapter 26. Italy and its Conquerors. The map in 1789. Italy in 1789, a fractured land, a chaotic patchwork of states, each vying for dominance, yet powerless to rise above their disunity. To the north, the Austrian Habsburgs ruled Lombardy and Tuscany, their influence seeping even into Naples, where a Bourbon king bowed to the will of Maria Carolina, an Austrian archduchess. The Austrian Empire almost encircled the peninsula, its shadow stretching over Sardinia's rulers in Piedmont, who could scarcely act without Austrian consent. Venice, once a titan of maritime power, had sunk into a stupor of decadence, wealth, and political paralysis, its military a distant memory. It clung to an illusion of safety, hoping refined pleasures could shield it from the inevitable tide of change. The Papal States, standing precariously alone, maintained an illusion of autonomy, balancing the jealousies of Europe's great powers and the ever-present weight of Catholic guilt. A nation's contrasts. Amid this broken mosaic, glimmers of potential fought to shine through the gloom. The Habsburgs, though demanding heavy taxes in the north, poured those funds into public works, schools, justice reforms, and even holding clergy accountable under the law. Tuscany under Leopold II was lauded as the best government in Europe, a rare beacon of competence and engagement. The Papal States, however, languished in corruption and decay. Poverty and disease haunted Rome, where the church clung to spectacle. Carnivals flourished even as the city crumbled. In Naples, Ferdinand, a king more interested in hunting than governance, left matters to his wife, Maria Carolina, who danced to the tune of Austrian and English interests. While the peasantry suffered, Naples itself held a paradox, a concentration of educated progressive minds, poised for change. And as Will Durant observed, Naples had more educated men and women of modern ideas than any other city in Italy, awaiting a spark that would come from Paris, Italy, and the French Revolution. Then across the Alps, the French Revolution erupted, its flames of liberty and equality reaching Italian ears. Italian thinkers, nurtured in cities like Milan and Naples, had long sowed the seeds of reform, and now those seeds began to sprout. Napoleon Bonaparte, an Italian by birth and a general of the French Revolutionary Army, drove out the Austrians, redrawing borders and awakening dormant dreams. To many, his arrival felt less like conquest and more like liberation. The Cisalpine Republic emerged, a new creation under French influence. For a brief, hopeful moment, Italians dared to imagine unity, but reality soon soured. French interference in the Catholic Church bred resentment. The people who had yearned for freedom saw their liberators become oppressors. Rome fell into French hands, the Pope himself taken captive, symbolizing a shift from salvation to subjugation. Naples briefly tasted revolution, only for its dreams to be dashed by royalist forces and foreign meddling. The cycle of hope and despair rolled on. Italy under Napoleon. Napoleon returned, fresh from Egypt and crowned as a ruler, to resume his designs on Italy. He swept aside resistance, his victories over the Austrians paving the way for puppet states under his control. As president of the Italian Republic and later emperor, Napoleon imposed reforms that seemed revolutionary. He streamlined bureaucracy, built roads and canals, and declared Italy the least taxed nation in Europe. Education flourished. Under his rule, schools sprang up, justice systems were modernized, and even the debt-ridden peasantry found opportunities in a changing economy. But the cost of this progress was steep. Taxes, though equitable, were relentless. Italian lands were drained to fund France's ambitions. Napoleon's conscription turned Italian sons into fodder for foreign wars. National pride crumbled under the weight of his control. Though his rule brought fleeting advancements, it left Italians yearning not for a foreign hand, but for their own unity and independence. Emperor and Pope. Napoleon underestimated the power of faith. He saw the Pope as a tool, the Church as a pawn in his grand design. But when the Papal States resisted, tensions boiled over. Napoleon seized Rome, imprisoned Pope Pius VII, and stripped the Papal States of their independence. Yet pious, though a captive, wielded the enduring strength of faith. From his exile, he became a symbol of defiance, ultimately outlasting Napoleon and reclaiming his place in Rome as a hero. Napoleon's struggle with the Church proved to be his undoing, a conflict that alienated the faithful and weakened his grip on Italy. Italians had glimpsed the possibility of freedom, but learned that true liberation could not be handed down by a foreign ruler. As Napoleon himself admitted, the union of Italy with France can only be temporary. Chapter 27, Austria. Enlightened Despots, 1780-92. In 1789, Austria stood strong, a cornerstone of European power and history. This was no fleeting prominence. It was a nation forged over centuries, built on sacrifice, resilience, and ambition. Their origins traced back to Celtic roots, their character enduring even as Rome's legions conquered, establishing Vindobona, Vienna's precursor, as a vital frontier post. Here, Marcus Aurelius himself defended against the Marcomanni in 170 AD, and later Charlemagne fortified the region as the East Mark. By 1278, Rudolf of Habsburg had laid the foundation for a dynasty that would endure until 1918. The Habsburgs were the defenders of Christendom, twice halting the advance of the Ottoman Turks and claiming vast swaths of Europe. Among the dynasty's figures stood Maria Theresa, a monarch who weathered the storms of Frederick the Great, and mother to a dozen children. She wove a web of dynastic marriages that placed her offspring on thrones across Europe, from Vienna to France. Yet Maria Theresa saw clearly the perils of her son Joseph's enlightened ambitions, foreseeing resistance to his bold but destabilizing reforms. Joseph sought to emancipate the serfs and grant religious freedoms, but misjudged the readiness of his people for such sweeping changes. His policies, driven by ideals but lacking pragmatism, led to upheaval, earning him the epitaph, "He invariably takes the second step before the first." Joseph's brother Leopold, by contrast, governed with measured wisdom. Having honed his skills in Tuscany, Leopold balanced reform with respect for tradition, soothing tensions in Hungary, Belgium, and Bohemia. Yet, the specter of the French Revolution loomed, threatening the old order. Leopold acted cautiously, but his sudden death left his plans incomplete, leaving Austria at a crossroads. Metternich. Amid the turmoil rose Clemens von Metternich, a man of noble birth. Born in 1773 along the Rhine, Metternich witnessed firsthand the ravages of revolution, solidifying his disdain for social upheaval. A master of diplomacy, his rise was meteoric, marked by shrewd alliances and unmatched political acumen. By 36, Metternich held the reins of Austria's foreign policy. Metternich's political brilliance shone brightest in his dealings with Napoleon, navigating alliances and rivalries with precision. He orchestrated Napoleon's marriage to Archduchess Marie-Louise, a move that shifted the European balance of power. Through diplomacy and strategy, Metternich steered Austria toward stability. At the heart of this tumult was Vienna, a city of 190,000, a mosaic of cultures and contradictions. Here, religious orthodoxy and authoritarian rule shaped a society marked by both submission and resilience. A growing entrepreneurial class thrived alongside a struggling working class, whose factory labor barely sustained them. Strict governance suppressed dissent, ensuring stability while fostering a culture of passivity. Yet, amidst this rigidity, the city's love for life flourished, in cafes, balls, and the rise of the waltz. Chapter 28, Beethoven. The Journey of Beethoven. On December 16, 1770, in Bonn, a city under the rule of a Catholic archbishop, a remarkable journey began. The Beethoven family was steeped in music. His grandfather sang bass, while his father, Johann, was a tenor. Despite their musical heritage, financial stability was elusive, and tendencies towards overindulgence in drink shadowed the family, a trait speculated to have impacted the young composer. Young Beethoven was subjected to relentless practice on the clavier and violin, often late into the night. Tears accompanied his arduous training, but hard work eventually led to triumph, as he performed a public concert at the tender age of 8. By 14, he joined the prince's orchestra as a viola player, contributing modestly to the family's income. By 1789, at just 19, he took on the responsibility of supporting his household, with half of his father's earnings funneled back to him. Then, in 1792, Count Waldstein urged him to labor diligently and absorb the spirit of Mozart from Haydn, as the French revolutionary troops seized the city, marking the end of his time in Bonn. Progress and struggles, 1792 to 1802. Vienna welcomed Beethoven, but it was an uneven terrain for the composer. He was a short, stocky man, often called the Moor due to his dark complexion. Upon learning of his father's passing, he sought financial aid from the Elector to support his brothers. Johann Kramer famously remarked, "This is the man who is to console us for the loss of Mozart." The Napoleonic campaigns ignited patriotic zeal in Austria, despite the country's humiliation. While he admired Napoleon, he later became disillusioned with the general, even rewriting a dedication to reflect his disappointment. Struggling mentally and emotionally, he oscillated between love and loathing for those around him, yet his devotion to the natural world remained constant. The heroic years, 1803 to 1809. During this period, Beethoven's music underwent a dramatic transformation. He abandoned the predictable paths of his predecessors, infusing his works with intense emotional contrasts. His personal pain flowed into a battle cry, evoking an assertive emotional strength. By 1808, Beethoven unveiled his Fifth and Sixth Symphonies, encapsulating contemplative depth and exuberant joy, a quest for love. As his career flourished, Beethoven's mind turned toward love. Often deemed a very sexual man, he sought companionship amidst societal solitude. His relationships were often fleeting, filled with unreciprocated affections, as seen in his early longing for a young girl who chose another. Yet, he quickly moved on, pursuing the widow Countess Josephine von Daim, and later Maria Bigot, who rejected his advances. Then came Therese Malfatti, who seemed to come closest to his heart. Upon discovering his true age, it seemed he was ready to marry. As Austria faced war again, cannon fire resounded through Vienna while Beethoven sought refuge in a basement, humorously considering strategy lessons. His pride brought him to Franz Brentano's home for economic support. After financial hurdles, support finally aligned for the Missa Solemnis, curated with dedicated power. His Ninth Symphony celebrated a joyful acceptance of liberty, restructuring old paradigms while embracing intimate expression. With the waning audience in Vienna, a promoter from Berlin offered a chance for renewed exposure. Despite facing vocal challenges during a performance, Beethoven remained oblivious to any discord. As the applause resounded, he stood unaware, lost. Commedia Finita, 1824 to 1827. Beethoven's final chapter began after the monumental performance that brought him acclaim. Struggling for financial fairness, he faced accusations and crumbling support amidst family crises. By December 2nd, a diagnosis of pneumonia left his spirit weary, yet he craved solace in alcohol. Even as his body weakened, Beethoven sought a loan to continue his work. In his final moments, he shared with family and friends, stating, "Commedia finita est," summarizing the comedy of life. He passed from this world on March 26, 1827, after months of suffering. When he took his last breath, it is said lightning illuminated the room, followed by a clap of thunder, a final act of defiance against fate. The autopsy revealed the damage done by alcohol. 30,000 mourners attended his funeral. Chapter 29, Germany and Napoleon. The Holy Roman Empire, 1800. In the year 1800, Germany saw an intellectual awakening, with giants like Goethe, Schiller, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and Schopenhauer reshaping philosophy and thought. Yet, politically, the landscape was fractured, with 250 independent states, each governed by its own laws, taxes, and armies. Amidst this disarray, the Holy Roman Empire persisted, though in name only, a mere shadow of its former self. Symbolic authority rested with Francis II of Austria, crowned in an elaborate ceremony after being elected in 1792. But the empire failed to unite its lands, further divided by deep religious rifts between the Catholic South and Protestant North. As the institution faltered, the writing on the wall became clear: fundamental changes were unavoidable. The weakened political structure invited external forces, particularly the looming influence of France, the Confederation of the Rhine, 1806. Into this void stepped Napoleon Bonaparte, positioning himself as the architect of a new order. Presenting his actions as necessary corrections after France's conquest of the Rhineland's left bank, Napoleon's ambitions quickly became evident. At the Congress of Rastatt, he reorganized Rhineland states, dismantling old power structures, including the authority of church officials. This reorganization created a dependency among regional rulers, who turned to Napoleon for protection. By 1806, the Confederation of the Rhine was born, a coalition of states, Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden among them, under French influence. On August 6, 1806, the Holy Roman Empire was formally dissolved, ending a centuries-old legacy. Napoleon introduced reforms, abolishing feudal dues, modernizing laws, and reducing corruption. But these gains came at a steep cost as the region's sovereignty eroded under foreign rule. The strain of Napoleon's dominion grew apparent when German sons were drafted to fight his wars, Napoleon's German provinces. In territories directly governed by Napoleon, such as Berg and Westphalia, French reforms brought significant modernization. Laws were codified, corruption reduced, and religious tolerance expanded. The economy saw free market principles take root, spurring entrepreneurship and standardizing trade. Even social welfare evolved. Communes were tasked with caring for the poor, ensuring employment or sustenance. A cultural renaissance followed, yet the price of these advancements was steep. Napoleon drained resources for his wars, imposed heavy taxation, and conscripted vast numbers of men. Initial enthusiasm waned as families realized their sons often did not return, casualties of distant, relentless campaigns. Saxony. In contrast, Saxony enjoyed relative tranquility and cultural vibrancy under the rule of Frederick Augustus III. Dresden grew as a cultural capital, showcasing the kingdom's wealth and refinement. Frederick skillfully navigated alliances, joining Napoleon under pressure, yet maintaining a degree of autonomy. His leadership allowed Saxony to recover prosperity swiftly, proving that calculated diplomacy could safeguard a nation's future. Prussia, the fall and rise. Prussia's trajectory in this era was one of dramatic collapse and determined rebirth. Under Frederick the Great, it had been a paragon of military and administrative excellence. But its successors faltered, personal pursuits overshadowed governance, and weak leadership left the nation vulnerable. By the late 1790s, Prussia's decline was evident. Diplomacy failed to protect its borders, and indecision allowed its enemies to grow stronger. Napoleon's crushing victories in 1806 at Jena and Auerstedt dealt a devastating blow. Prussia lost nearly half its territory and population. Yet, from this despair emerged resilience. Visionaries like Stein and Hardenberg spearheaded reforms, abolishing feudalism and empowering towns with self-governance. Military leaders restructured the army. By 1812, these efforts began to bear fruit. Prussia, battered but unbroken, stood poised to reclaim its place in history. Chapter 30: The German People. Economics. While revolutionaries across the Rhine ignited fervor, Germans seemed more content or perhaps resigned to their roles within a rigid social hierarchy. Everyone keeps his rank, Madame de Staël observed, capturing the essence of their world. Status was primarily a matter of birth. Change arrived slowly, nearly glacially. Their own revolutionary awakening wouldn't surface until 1848. Despite the wealth of natural resources and a network of rivers, the old feudal order stifled commerce and industry. It was like watching a powerful bird, full of potential for flight, yet tethered to its perch. A patchwork of fragmented states, riddled with inadequate roads and a maze of tolls and currencies, further complicated trade. Meanwhile, England buzzed with the Industrial Revolution, guarding its technological advancements closely. Still, the Continental Blockade provided a brief opportunity for local industries, especially mining and metallurgy in the Rhineland. Along the riverbanks, figures like Friedrich Krupp began laying the groundwork for industrial empires that would grow far greater. Despite the wealth of natural resources and a network of rivers, the old feudal order stifled commerce and industry. It was like watching a powerful bird, full of potential for flight, yet tethered to its perch. Along the riverbanks, figures like Friedrich Krupp began laying the groundwork for industrial empires that would grow far greater. Yet merchants remained largely viewed with disdain by traditional elites, a telling sign of deep-seated conservatism. Even the suggestion of establishing a national bank stirred apprehension among the powerful, reflecting their fear of relinquishing control. Prussia, particularly, seemed to be electing a path away from capitalist growth, favoring military strength instead, a decision that would echo through history. Believers and doubters. The German religious landscape bore the scars of the 30 Years' War. The echoes of Frederick the Great's battles lingered, intertwining faith and power with lasting consequences. Had he faced defeat, one wonders what fate awaited the Protestants. What was undeniable, however, was the clergy's reliance on military protection, leaving them subservient to civil authority. This relationship led some to turn inwards, seeking solace in Pietism. They desired a more personal faith, shunning the rigid restrictions of established religion. The ideas of the French Enlightenment, shared by thinkers like Lessing, began to ripple through German thought. Kant stirred the intellectual waters with his critique of pure reason, challenging the very foundations of rational theology. Lichtenberg predicted that religious belief would fade into myth. Doubt and longing seemed to coexist in a delicate dance, as educated men sought meaning in a world struggling to make sense of itself. The German Jews. In the backdrop of progress emerged the Jewish community, yearning for recognition. Knowledge illuminated corners long overshadowed by prejudice. Toleration gradually increased as Christians realized the futility of old animosities. Liberated from their ghettos by Joseph II, Napoleon, and later Hardenberg, Jews sought their place in society. They adopted the dress and language of their German neighbors, integrating into new communities. Yet anti-Semitism lingered, particularly in poor regions. It had shifted, no longer driven solely by religious differences but influenced by socioeconomic factors. In Goethe's Frankfurt, a lingering anti-Jewish sentiment persisted, even as Meyer Amschel Rothschild quietly built a formidable banking dynasty. Paradoxically, it was Napoleon who mandated that Frankfurt extend freedoms to all under his Napoleonic code, morals. For ages, a vengeful vision of God dictated social structures. It enforced familial discipline, modesty, and obedience. Yet the common German man, often jovial, felt compelled to maintain an image of sternness. Tradition was valued as a stabilizing force, especially in contrast to the French, who seemed to cast it aside. German men believed in the essence of tradition as a guide for children, a method to instill stability. Meanwhile, wives were largely accepting of their roles, guiding their children within the confines of domesticity. German women, inspired by figures like Mary Wollstonecraft, began to assert themselves, calling for liberation. With this shift in moral values, new attitudes about relationships emerged. It became increasingly acceptable for kings to have mistresses, and love began to supersede arranged marriages. Even Goethe, initially critical of Berlin's fast crowd, began to embrace evolving customs. Amidst this progress, bribery and corruption remained prevalent in diplomatic circles. To grasp Germany's resurgence, one must acknowledge the significance of education. In a time marked by national humiliation, the Germans recognized education as vital to their military aspirations. A new identity formed around the idea that cultivating intellect was crucial for the nation. Fichte's addresses to the German nation called for the transformative power of national education. Wilhelm von Humboldt, appointed education minister of Prussia in 1809, played a pivotal role in these developments. His vision transformed the universities of Göttingen, Heidelberg, and Jena into hubs of knowledge, drawing intellects from across Europe. Education began to reach wider segments of the population, encompassing broader subjects. Chapter 31: German Literature, Revolution and Response. In those early days, the German intellect, scholars, poets, and philosophers greeted the French Revolution with almost naive enthusiasm. They envisioned it as the dawn of a new age, a promise of liberty long yearned for. Many minds, steeped in the Enlightenment, saw these ideals finding their earthly expression at last. Yet, this vision began to darken as tales of the terror reached German ears, stories of bloodshed and arbitrary executions. And when Napoleon's armies occupied German lands, that initial fervor cooled, replaced by a growing skepticism. For some, this skepticism deepened into outright opposition. Weimar. Amidst shifting political tides, the court of Weimar became a sanctuary for the German spirit. Here we find a celebrated quartet of thinkers and writers who shaped the era. Christoph Wieland, initially a supporter of the revolution, grew disillusioned, believing true reform lay in personal moral growth, not sudden upheaval. Johann Gottfried von Herder saw the revolution as the tragic failure of lofty ideals to manifest in human action, yet glimpsed its potential for social betterment. Friedrich Schiller, once the fiery playwright of Die Räuber, turned from revolutionary fervor to a contemplative liberalism inspired by the ideals of ancient Greece. And Goethe, initially appalled by revolutionary violence, later admired the order Napoleon brought to France. Chapter 32, German Philosophy. Fichte, 1762 to 1814. Johann Gottlieb Fichte's life reads like an odyssey of intellectual and personal transformation. Born to a poor ribbon weaver, his early aspirations pointed toward the ministry. Yet a chance encounter with Spinoza's philosophy shattered that path and launched him into a life of restless inquiry. From village to village, often impoverished, Fichte's journey took him from a doubting theologian to an ardent disciple of Kant. For a time, he flirted with revolutionary ideals, but he ultimately found his calling as a professor at Jena. Dismissed for his radical views, Fichte advocated for a state-controlled economy grounded in moral imperatives. For Fichte, the self was sacred, a vessel through which humanity grappled with its moral obligations. Napoleon's incursions unexpectedly recast Fichte as a national hero. His addresses to the German nation were both a call to arms and a plea for educational reform, awakening a spirit of unity among his people. Schelling, 1775 to 1854. While Fichte elevated the mind, Schelling saw nature as its equal, a dynamic partner in the cosmos. Together with Hölderlin and Hegel, Schelling formed part of Jena's radical circle, a crucible of revolutionary ideas. From Spinoza, Schelling drew inspiration, viewing both nature and mind as expressions of a divine force, not a passive god, but one alive with energy. His philosophy of nature described a world where the inert and the vital were part of a living continuum, a daring vision that inspired romantic thinkers. Though initially seen as a follower of Fichte, Schelling soon forged his own path, captivating an audience hungry for dynamism and thought. But the death of his wife in 1809 marked a turning point. As Hegel's ideas gained prominence, Schelling's star waned. He withdrew into mysticism and obscurity, his earlier brilliance eclipsed by personal loss in the march of time. Hegel, 1770 to 1831. As a theology student in Tübingen, Hegel, alongside Schelling and Hölderlin, questioned the dogmas of their time. The French Revolution ignited in him a passion for reason, drawing him away from traditional Christian doctrine. His early career saw him teaching in Jena, a city charged with intellectual energy, until Napoleon's invasion forced him to flee. In his Phenomenology of Mind, Hegel explored humanity's struggle to interpret reality. His logic detailed the structure of thought itself, tracing how ideas evolve through conflict and resolution. Hegel's famous dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, revealed a universe in perpetual motion, ever striving toward new forms. For Hegel, freedom was the ultimate goal, achieved not in anarchy but in alignment with reason and collective purpose. Unlike Fichte, who revered the individual, Hegel championed the state as a rational force that nurtures the common good. He celebrated institutions like family, education, and property as vital to societal health. As his career advanced, Hegel even re-examined the value of faith, seeing in it a pathway to a higher moral purpose. Hegel's ideas shaped the future, influencing thinkers from Marx to modern political theorists. He died as he lived, a philosopher whose thoughts never ceased to evolve, forever grappling with tension, change, and the pulse of history. Chapter 33, Around the Heartland. Switzerland. The serene Swiss mountains trembled as the French Revolution sent shockwaves through Europe. At first, it stirred a sense of hope. Historian Johannes von Müller even proclaimed it the most pivotal moment since Rome's fall, a sentiment emblematic of the era's optimism. But as the Jacobins' radicalism spiraled, the Swiss realized that liberty without wisdom often leads to chaos. La Harpe, once a liberal voice in the Russian court, returned home to stoke unrest, igniting tensions. Then came Napoleon, a master of power and opportunity. He swept in, dismantled the old ways, and declared the Helvetic Republic. Yet Switzerland, fractured by internal strife, struggled with self-governance. They turned to Napoleon for help, forcing his hand again. Through the act of mediation, he laid the foundation of modern Switzerland, earning the title Restorer of Liberty, a name not entirely undeserved. Sweden. Sweden's journey through the revolutionary storm was distinct. King Gustavus III initially embraced the French Revolution, seeing it as a tool to balance power against the estates. But when its tide turned against monarchies, he sought to form a coalition to counter it. Discontented nobles, threatened by his ambitions, conspired to assassinate him. Gustavus IV ascended but led Sweden into turmoil, losing Finland to Russia and faltering the monarchy. A pivotal shift came with Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, a Napoleonic officer, adopted as Crown Prince. Eventually, Crown Prince Charles John boldly took charge. He opposed Napoleon, allied with Russia, and strategically traded with Britain, defying the continental blockade. It was pragmatism, not ideology, that guided Sweden's path. Denmark. Denmark, in contrast, weathered the revolution with relative calm. Having abolished serfdom in 1772, they had already undertaken reforms. Though initially neutral, Denmark resisted Britain's demand to search their ships. This stance led to their inclusion in the Second League of Armed Neutrality, alongside Russia, Prussia, and Sweden. But Nelson's British fleet struck swiftly at Copenhagen, forcing Denmark to negotiate and exit the League. In 1807, Britain seized the Danish navy, pushing Denmark into an uneasy alliance with France. Poland, a nation divided, partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, it refused to succumb. Napoleon, after defeating Russia and Austria, was seen as a liberator. Though Kosciuszko warned against placing faith in him, the Polish people longed for liberation. Their loyalty was profound, their sacrifices immense. Napoleon rewarded this devotion by creating the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, built upon French legal principles. For a brief, shining moment, Poland glimpsed autonomy. Turkey in Europe. The Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self, plagued by weak sultans and corruption. Serbia, under Karađorđe, launched a failed revolution, but Milos Obrenović later secured limited self-governance. Greece, inspired by its storied past, ignited a revolution in 1821, achieving independence by 1830. Even in decline, the Ottomans harbored deep traditions of philosophy, poetry, and beauty. Sultan Selim III sought modernization but was deposed. His successor navigated a fragile empire, allying with Russia in the Treaty of Bucharest. Chapter 34. Russia. The Russian milieu. Talleyrand, with his legendary acumen, foresaw Russia's rise as a dominant power. The Russian people were forged by centuries of hardship. Tatar invasions, an unforgiving climate, and relentless toil shaped their spirit. Comfort was a stranger to them. Endurance became their closest ally. Cruelty, born of survival, marked their character, yet beneath this tough exterior lay a profound, almost philosophical questioning of their struggles, echoes of Dostoevsky's Karamazov's. Religion offered solace, with priests serving as both spiritual guides and instruments of state power, a dual role expertly manipulated by the czars. The nobility ruled with unchecked authority over their serfs, treating them as property, yet bound by the complexities of familial ties. By 1800, nearly half of Russia's population lived in serfdom, fueling tension between the countryside's vast expanse and the towns. Commerce began to stir, but the friction between the taxed merchant class and the untaxed nobility threatened progress. Education sparked new ideas among the elite, igniting conflicts between an evolving middle class and a rigid aristocracy. The common folk, generous yet hardened, navigated a brutal social structure where survival often required cunning. Alcohol loosened inhibitions and sometimes darkened their behavior. The court itself mirrored Versailles, where French was spoken, decadence reigned, and yet the distinctly Russian soul remained beneath the glittering facade. The reign of Paul I, 1796 to 1801. At the heart of this spectacle was Paul I. Haunted by his father's probable murder and his mother's betrayal in seizing the throne, Paul lived under the shadow of death and mistrust. While he took the throne by rightful inheritance, his rule oscillated wildly between reform and tyranny. He freed political prisoners, stabilized currency, and improved healthcare, but imposed draconian rules that stifled personal freedoms. Obsessed with military regimentation, Paul dictated even the smallest details, from uniforms to hairstyles, breeding resentment. His foreign policy was erratic, shifting alliances with Napoleon. Ultimately, his unpredictability and autocratic grip led to his assassination. The education of an emperor. Alexander I, Paul's son, presented a striking contrast to his father, a man shaped to lead with intellect and grace. Under the watchful eye of his grandmother, Catherine the Great, Alexander's education was entrusted to a Swiss philosopher who immersed him in Enlightenment ideals. Fluent in French and steeped in philosophy, history, and Christian ethics, he was groomed for greatness. But the harsh realities of power disillusioned the young prince, leaving him yearning for a simpler life far from the throne. Fate, however, had other plans. The young Tsar, 1801-04. Upon ascending the throne, Alexander sought to reform his fractured empire. He freed political prisoners, dismissed corrupt officials, and surrounded himself with brilliant advisors. Inspired by Napoleon's administrative model, he modernized governance but retained the deeply entrenched institution of serfdom. Reforms were cautious, his vision limited by an uneducated populace and resistant nobility. Still, he outlawed torture, dismantled the secret police, and opened Russian borders for travel. Universities flourished under his reign, heralding a new era of intellectual progress. The Jewish community under Alexander. The Jewish population, long confined to the Pale of Settlement, saw their circumstances shift under Alexander's rule. While restrictions like the prohibition of liquor sales tightened, new opportunities emerged, such as the right to choose rabbis and pursue education. Alexander's approach was strategic, balancing Jewish emancipation with the broader interests of his empire. As Napoleon extended his influence, Alexander recognized the strategic importance of retaining Jewish loyalty. The conflicts between Alexander and Napoleon, 1805-12. Alexander and Napoleon, titans of their age, clashed in a battle of wills and empires. Their uneasy peace at Tilsit divided Europe, but mistrust and economic strain made it fragile. As tensions escalated, Alexander's faith deepened, framing Napoleon as an agent of chaos he was destined to oppose. Thus, Russia prepared for war, a confrontation that would reshape the continent and Alexander's legacy forever. Chapter 35. To Moscow. The Continental Blockade. Napoleon's ambitious vision of the Continental Blockade was an attempt to strangle Britain economically. By shutting every European port to British goods, he sought to compel Britain to cease its interference with French trade, restore French colonies, and stop financing France's enemies. At first, the plan inflicted severe blows. British exports plummeted, cotton imports dried up, and the price of corn soared. Depression swept across Britain, wages fell, riots erupted, and desperation mounted. Starved of Russian timber and Swedish iron, Britain turned to trade with Portugal, Spain, and Turkey, setting the stage for the Peninsular War. In contrast, France seemed to thrive. Without British competition, French industry boomed, and France narrowed the gap in the unfolding Industrial Revolution. Yet this prosperity was uneven. France's domestic commerce benefited, but foreign trade withered. The blockade's greatest foe, however, was human nature. Smuggling grew as merchants circumvented restrictions, defying Napoleon's vision. Even Napoleon's brother, King Louis Bonaparte of Holland, voiced dissent, appealing directly to Russia's Tsar. Napoleon responded by deploying 200,000 customs agents and troops, burning contraband in public displays of enforcement. Yet hypocrisy lingered. Napoleon himself granted licenses for British imports, further fueling discontent, particularly in Russia. By 1810, Britain faced bankruptcy while France seemed to bask in its success. But this illusion of stability masks the cracks forming beneath the surface. France plunges into depression, 1811. In 1811, the French economy collapsed. The textile industry, starved of raw materials, faltered under soaring tariffs on cotton. Banks began to fail, triggering a cascade of financial ruin. Unemployment soared, riots erupted, and the specter of revolution loomed once more. Napoleon responded with force. Soldiers suppressed unrest, and food distribution began. He lifted the blockade temporarily to import grain, yet even this offered little relief. Farmers hoarded wheat, waiting for higher prices, while the streets of France grew desperate. Relief arrived briefly with the harvest of 1812. Bread prices fell and banks reopened, but this fleeting reprieve was overshadowed by Napoleon's next move, the invasion of Russia, a precarious prelude to war, 1811 to 1812. As tensions with Russia escalated, Napoleon's ambassador, Caulaincourt, warned against invasion, but Napoleon, distrustful of the Tsar's intentions, pressed on. Both sides scrambled for alliances. Russia turned to Sweden, while Napoleon coerced Prussia and Austria into his fold. Napoleon framed the coming conflict as a crusade against Slavic barbarism, but within his own ranks disillusionment grew. Conscription numbers faltered, and the French populace, weary of endless war, offered little enthusiasm. Even Napoleon's generals harbored doubts. Yet he marched forward with an army of 680,000 men. The road to Moscow. By June 1812, Napoleon's forces crossed into Russian territory, initiating one of history's most fateful campaigns. The early days were grueling. Scorching heat by day, freezing nights, and relentless rain battered the advancing troops. Supplies faltered, and discipline broke down as soldiers looted villages. Napoleon's frustrations mounted. He failed to trap Russian forces at Vilna, and his pursuit grew sluggish. His generals urged caution, suggesting winter quarters, but Napoleon pressed on, believing time was not on his side. By September, the French faced the Russians at Borodino in a brutal clash. The battle, marked by extraordinary bloodshed, left both sides devastated. Though Napoleon claimed victory, his army emerged battered and diminished. When he finally entered Moscow, it was a hollow triumph. The city, abandoned and soon set aflame, offered no spoils, no provisions, and no peace. Napoleon's gamble had brought him to the heart of Russia, but it left him stranded, with the specter of defeat looming over the horizon. The burning of Moscow. Napoleon was enchanted by Moscow. He declared it one of the most beautiful cities he had ever seen. Its stone churches survived the flames, but its wooden houses, some 11,000, were consumed in the inferno, alongside 6,000 structures thought to be fireproof. When the French marched into the city, small fires broke out. By the night of September 15th, the flames erupted into an uncontrollable blaze, illuminating the dark skies. On the morning of the 16th, panic gripped Murat and Eugene, who feared the Kremlin's stores of gunpowder might ignite. Napoleon, reluctant but prudent, left for a suburban palace. When the fire subsided on September 18th, 2/3 of Moscow lay in ashes. Napoleon to the Kremlin, but the question lingered: who set the fire? Was it careless looting by French soldiers or deliberate sabotage by Russian hands? One Russian military policeman confessed he acted on orders, and others pointed to Governor Count Rostopkin as the mastermind. On September 20th, Napoleon wrote to Tsar Alexander, seeking dialogue, but silence was his reply. Alexander, unwavering, vowed to fight to the last man. "If my dynasty must fall," he proclaimed, "I will retreat to Siberia before I sign my nation's shame." The burning of Moscow rallied Russian resolve. Napoleon, now seen as a destroyer of their sacred city, was vilified. The French, demoralized, held drills, concerts, and plays, but their spirits remained shattered. As weeks passed without word from Alexander, Napoleon admitted his grim reality. By October, his only option was retreat, his grand ambitions reduced to ashes. The retreat from Moscow, a march into hell. Napoleon's last hope lay in Kaluga, where Kutuzov had amassed supplies. If he could force a decisive battle there, peace might still be possible. On October 19th, the French army of 50,000 soldiers and 50,000 non-combatants began their withdrawal. They carried supplies for just 20 days. At Maloaroslavets, the French clashed with Kutuzov's forces. Although they forced the Russians to retreat, Napoleon recognized his men were unfit for prolonged conflict. Reluctantly, he turned back, retracing his steps through the devastated road to Borodino. Winter descended with ferocity. Snow fell on October 29th, blanketing the landscape and turning roads to sheets of ice. Horses collapsed, carts overturned, and soldiers froze in their tracks. Napoleon, alternately riding in his carriage and walking among his men, offered encouragement, but morale crumbled. By November 13th, the remnants of the army reached Smolensk. There, promised supplies were missing, sparking chaos as starving troops fought over scraps of food. Pursued relentlessly by Kutuzov, Napoleon pressed onward, desperate to escape. The most perilous moment came at the Berezina River. With Russian forces closing in from all sides, Napoleon's engineers worked tirelessly in icy waters to construct pontoon bridges. On November 26th, the army began crossing under relentless attack. As the bridges collapsed, many fell to their deaths in the freezing river. The emperor's flight, from sublime to ridiculous. By December, the army was shattered. At the Niemen crossing, where 400,000 had begun their march in June, just 30,000 limped back. Napoleon, recognizing his ineffectiveness with his troops, decided to return to Paris. Traveling incognito, he disguised himself as a secretary to avoid detection. In Warsaw, he famously remarked, "From the sublime to the ridiculous is but a step." On December 18th, after 13 grueling days of travel, he arrived at the Tuileries. He embraced his wife and sent word to Josephine that their son was safe. A tale of hubris and ruin. Napoleon's campaign to Moscow and back was a catastrophe. Though he claimed victories and occupied Moscow, the cost was incalculable. Pride, strategic missteps, and the unforgiving Russian winter decimated his army. His bulletin number 29 sought to explain the loss, blaming the climate and emphasizing his own good health. But the truth was clear: Napoleon's gamble had failed. His dream of dominion was left frozen in the Russian snow. Chapter 36. To Elba. To Berlin. The restless states of Europe yearned to break free from French domination. They sought to restore the order that existed before Napoleon's rise. Long-established borders and national identities were reasserting themselves, challenging the empire's foundations. Italians mourned their dead, while Romans clamored for the restoration of the papacy. Austrians longed to dissolve their forced alliance with France. Prussia, fueled by a desire for reform, was particularly eager to regain its strength. Memories of Fichte's rallying cries echoed in their hearts. Meanwhile, Russia pursued the retreating French army, driven by determination and ambition. On December 18, 1812, Tsar Alexander left St. Petersburg, seeking unity for a European front against Napoleon. He marched into East Prussia, receiving a hero's welcome from the Prussian people. Frederick William III hesitated, caught between loyalties to France and Russia, while his subjects cried for Alexander's leadership. Alexander promised Polish leaders amnesty and a kingdom, tightening Russia's grip on Poland while leaving Prussia waiting for rewards. The surge of nationalism swept through Prussia, calling them to action. The middle class grew resentful of economic strain, while Christians eyed Napoleon with suspicion. On March 17th, Frederick William III emerged to rally the nation with "Am mein Volk," a passionate call to arms. Priests, professors, and even Goethe lent their support, and soon, 60,000 soldiers stood ready to join the 50,000 Russians in a united effort to dethrone Napoleon. To Prague. Napoleon's once unshakable strength began to falter. His health declined, and the nation grew weary of relentless conflict. France's population, exhausted from war, began to question his leadership, and even the clergy felt discontent. His generals, pressed for peace, grew restless. Driven by pride, Napoleon turned to familiar tactics: taxes, loans, and conscription. By mid-April, he had gathered 225,000 men, appointing Marie-Louise as regent. On May 2nd, at Lutzen, he clashed with the Allies, securing a victory but at grave cost. Despite this, King Frederick Augustus I of Saxony joined him, reinforcing his ranks with 10,000 soldiers. To quell unrest in northern Italy, Napoleon directed Eugene to Milan, while his army faced off against the Allies again on May 18th. Yet Ney's blunder allowed the Allies to retreat. Choosing peace over continued conflict, Napoleon entered negotiations and secured a 2-month armistice. During this truce, the Allies mobilized and Bernadotte joined them, adding 25,000 men to their ranks. On June 27th, the Allies sent envoys to Prague demanding territory and concessions from France. Napoleon's response was a conditional acceptance, ultimately submitted after the deadline. On August 11th, Austria declared allegiance with the coalition, reigniting war once more. To the Rhine. With Austria's entry, the Allies amassed 492,000 soldiers, while Napoleon could only muster 440,000. The Allies organized into 3 formidable armies: Bernadotte's Army of the North, Blücher's Army of Silesia, and Schwarzenberg's Army of Bohemia. In response, Napoleon formed an army of the left under Oudinot and selected Ney to lead the center. He held the right in reserve against Schwarzenberg's approach. On August 12th, Blücher struck Ney at Katzbach, while Schwarzenberg aimed for the French headquarters in Dresden. Napoleon swiftly marched 100,000 men to confront the Austrians, resulting in a victory on August 26th. Yet, tragedy struck as Moreau was mortally wounded. Vandam's reckless pursuit led to his capture by Austrian forces, while Ney's army suffered heavy losses at Dennowitz. With reinforcements delayed, Napoleon sought to conscript 280,000 new soldiers, knowing they would need time to train. By October 8th, Bavarian forces joined Napoleon's opposition. The Allies sought to encircle Napoleon at Leipzig, where they surrounded him with 160,000 men against his 115,000. The Battle of Nations ensued over 3 grueling days. On October 18th, Saxon and Rhine troops defected. As ammunition ran low, Napoleon ordered a retreat, leading to the tragic drowning of many as they fled across a bridge. Only 60,000 of his original force reached safety on November 2nd, crossing back into France near Mainz. To the breaking point. Napoleon's position grew desperate. With only 60,000 soldiers remaining, Italy teetered on instability. Simultaneously, France faced internal chaos. Riots erupted, driven by desperation and hunger. On November 9th, Napoleon returned to prepare for a new campaign, determined to raise an additional 300,000 troops. On November 9th, a peace offer from the Allies arrived, allowing him to keep France's natural borders. He accepted it on December 2nd, but with turmoil brewing in Holland, the Allies withdrew their offer. The Declaration of Frankfurt soon followed, declaring war on Napoleon himself. The French Senate grew defiant as Allied forces entered France on December 21st. Amidst mounting unrest, Napoleon confronted the legislature with fury on January 1, 1814. He claimed to be the true representative of the people, desperate to maintain his power. By January 21st, he freed the Pope, and 2 days later introduced his family to the National Guard. Yet, as Italy allied with enemies, Napoleon prepared to confront the looming invasion. To Paris. Allied armies closed in on Paris. The French armies struggled to advance, hindered by fatigue and logistical challenges. Napoleon stationed his troops at Chalon-sur-Marne, outnumbered 2-1. He sought to disrupt the Allies through tactical attacks, and despite showing brilliance in strategy, he faced dwindling resources. Victory against Blücher at Brienne on January 29th gave hope, but heavy losses stalled his advance. In a decisive clash at La Retière, he faced an overwhelming Allied force. By March 29th, the combined Allies reached the outskirts of Paris. Panic gripped the populace as fearful civilians rushed to defend their city. Paris surrendered by dawn on March 31st. The Senate convened, creating a provisional government, sealing Napoleon's fate. To peace. In the wake of Paris' fall, Napoleon was stationed 150 miles away at Street d'Isieux. He rushed toward his capital, only to learn it had been lost. As hope dwindled, he prepared for confrontation. His marshals urged him to surrender. Marmont betrayed him during the night of April 5th, Departing Paris with a portion of the army, the Allies demanded an unconditional surrender to halt negotiations. Meanwhile, Alexander, aiming to preserve the city from devastation, sought a solution. He orchestrated the Treaty of Fontainebleau, allowing Napoleon to live in exile on Elba with a pension, while he relinquished his claims to France. Marie-Louise departed for Vienna, unable to join him. Stricken by despair, Napoleon tried to ingest poison but found it ineffective, opting instead to pen his memoirs. His farewell to Josephine and the old guard evoked great emotion as he implored them to support the new king. On April 28th, he embarked for Elba, having chosen to accept his fate. There he would spend the next 9 months seeking peace in a world that had turned its back on him. Chapter 37. To Waterloo. Louis XVIII, the unlikely monarch. Louis XVIII, born the fourth son of a French nobleman, began life as the Comte de Provence, steeped in literature and court intrigue. His comfortable existence shattered in 1791 when his brother, Louis XVI, sought escape from France, a journey Louis also embarked on. After the tragic executions of his brother and nephew, he claimed the throne in exile, enduring years of wandering before finding refuge in England, where he admired the British constitutional model. When invited back to France by the Senate, he acknowledged his divine right as king, asserting his authority was granted by God, not men. Yet, Louis preserved the Napoleonic Code, upheld financial stability, and embraced social reforms. The church sought the reinstatement of its confiscated lands, and citizens resented enforced church attendance. Those who had acquired church properties feared a Bourbon backlash, nostalgic for Napoleon's era. Discharged officers from the army yearned for their glorious past under Napoleon as resentment brewed. The stage was set for his dramatic return, the Congress of Vienna. On June 8, 1815, the Allies redrew Europe's map. Britain gained Malta, while Poland's fate hung in the air amidst a collective denunciation of the slave trade, hypocritical given many nations' participation in it. A shadow loomed, Napoleon's presence in Elba. The assembled diplomats recognized the threat but failed to reach a consensus on containing him. Then, on March 7th, the shocking news of Napoleon's escape reverberated through Vienna. By March 13th, he was declared an outlaw. Elba. Napoleon's exile on the island of Elba, just 86 square miles, was a mere stage for his imperial ambitions. Although he enjoyed visits from family and the comforts of his elegant residence, a sense of isolation grew unbearable. With news of unrest in France reaching him, Napoleon felt the discontent of the people longing for his return. His mother urged him on. The incredible journey, March 1st to 20th, 1815. Napoleon's audacious gamble began with his landing at Antibes. Though met with indifference, the common people silently yearned for their emperor. Anticipating hostility, Napoleon chose a stealthy route to Paris through the mountains. They trekked 150 miles in 4 days. As he advanced to Grenoble and then Lyons, the tide solidified in his favor. Louis XVIII's attempts to capture him failed miserably. Even his own Marshal Ney, tasked with subduing Napoleon, rallied to his side. On March 20th, Napoleon rode triumphantly into Paris, reclaiming the throne with jubilant crowds cheering his return after a 720-mile march without a shot fired. The last campaign, a world at war. On June 15, 1815, mobilized with 126,000 men, Napoleon aimed for swift victory against Wellington and Blucher's armies before they could unite. The Allies moved quickly as Napoleon struggled with disorganized operations. On June 18th, Napoleon faced Wellington at Waterloo. Napoleon's previous vigor had waned. Ignoring counsel to unite troops, he believed the odds favored him, gambling on what remained of his strength. As the battle wore on, brutal casualties mounted. By 4 p.m., as despair set in amidst the relentless fight, Ney's final charge faltered, and with the arrival of the Prussians, catastrophe struck. The cries of retreat pierced the air as Napoleon's army dissolved. 25,000 French fell. As the dust settled, so did Napoleon's sway over Europe, revealing in clarity the misjudgment of his ambitions. Chapter 38. To St. Helena. The Second Abdication, June 22, 1815. Napoleon stumbled into Paris, utterly spent after days without food or sleep. He thought that a mere 2 hours of rest could revive him. But the Chamber of Representatives was already plotting his downfall. Amid the chaos, he tried to establish a temporary dictatorship, but the people's cries filled the air. They wanted to fight, yet Napoleon, the cautious strategist, refused to become the king of Jacqueries, unwilling to see Paris drenched in blood for his sake. He wanted a new army of 300,000, a dream that shattered as Allied forces from Austria, Bavaria, and Württemberg advanced towards the city. History seemed to be repeating itself. The chamber soon declared the situation unsustainable. Fouché had seen this coming. He had stated, "The emperor will win 1 or 2 battles, he will lose the third. At that point our role will begin." He was right, but he couldn't wait. Lucien, Napoleon's brother, attempted to resist, but weary and worn, Napoleon surrendered to the inevitable. On June 22nd, he dictated his second abdication, framing it as a selfless act for France. He wanted to crown his son, Napoleon II, but this was not to be. The abdication was accepted, and Fouché took control. Napoleon found himself at Malmaison. He requested safe passage to America while Fouché schemed behind the scenes. By June 28th, the Prussians were closing in, led by the relentless Blücher, who sought Napoleon, dead or alive. Napoleon bid farewell to the loyal soldiers who remained. At 5 p.m. on June 29th, he left Malmaison, just hours before Blücher's cavalry arrived, a narrow escape for the fallen emperor. The Second Restoration, July 7th, 1815. By July 7th, the Allies marched into Paris, and the next day, Louis XVIII reclaimed his throne. Thus ended the 100 Days, Napoleon's brief resurgence of power. Most of the nation accepted this outcome, but Blücher's thirst for vengeance remained unquenched. He plotted the destruction of symbols of Napoleon's victories until he was dissuaded by Wellington, Louis XVIII, and the Tsar. Louis XVIII, willing to forgive many, could not extend that mercy to Ney, who had betrayed the cause at Waterloo. Captured and tried for treason, Ney faced a firing squad on December 7, 1815. Amidst this turmoil, Fouché and Talleyrand found themselves navigating the shifting tides of power. Fouché's cunning led to his initial removal, only to be reinstated as a minister. Talleyrand, always the survivor, faced suspicion from royalists yet maintained influence. Louis XVIII aptly remarked that Talleyrand had both helped and hindered him, while Talleyrand remarked that Louis has learned nothing and forgotten nothing. On November 20th, 1815, Louis XVIII signed the Second Treaty of Paris. France was forced to cede territory and endure crippling reparations, while art looted by their generals had to be returned. Talleyrand refused to sign, and his successor did so under duress, declaring himself dishonored. Surrender, July 4th to August 8th, 1815. Napoleon journeyed south from Malmaison, reaching Rochefort, where British warships awaited. By July 4th, Napoleon asked if the frigates could be readied to escape to America. The risk was high, and a cycle of uncertainty followed for 9 days. Napoleon was left with 3 choices: surrender, risk capture, or seek refuge with the British. Choosing the latter, he wrote a letter seeking protection, but it never reached the Prince Regent. On July 15th, he finally surrendered, informing Maitland, "I come aboard your ship to place myself under the protection of the laws of England." Maitland ensured his safe passage. Napoleon impressed Maitland with his demeanor. The British crew treated him with respect. Admiral Keith received him with the decorum due a former emperor, but without discussions of his fate. The British government debated how to handle the once mighty Napoleon, ultimately deciding on St. Helena, a remote island, to prevent escape. Devastated, Napoleon braced himself for life in exile, understanding his fate was sealed. Allowed only 5 companions and limited resources, they made preparations for the difficult journey ahead. On August 8th, they set sail for St. Helena. Chapter 39, To the End. St. Helena, a tiny, desolate island. The British, with their customary politeness, invited him to dine. But for a man of his stature, such small talk was a triviality. Hours of idle chatter held no value to a commander of men. They called him general, a painful reminder that his storied past was slipping away. So he began dictating his memoirs to preserve his legacy. With a group of steadfast followers, he embraced confinement, the harsh island reflecting their plight. Despite the squalor around him, he maintained a semblance of imperial splendor. He dined with fine silverware, adorned in military regalia. Even in captivity, he insisted on the title emperor, refusing any letter addressing him as just a general. This curious masquerade, a persistent shadow of power, endured until a new governor took charge. Hudson Lowe. Tasked with safeguarding Napoleon, Hudson also monitored him closely to prevent escape. However, when he sought an audience, he was met with refusal. Napoleon was ill. Napoleon catalogued his many grievances: guards too close for comfort, restrictions on movement. Lowe, limited by orders from the crown, was paralyzed in his attempts to act. As costs mounted, Lowe informed Bertrand that they were accountable for any financial excesses. When Napoleon proposed selling his silver to ease the burden, Lowe coldly denied him. He had no compassion, driven solely by duty. Though Napoleon's family offered support, he declined, anticipating their struggles. Despite a raised allowance, Napoleon could hardly contain his fury, branding Lowe a calamity. The great companions. Then there were his devoted companions, true knights in the grim saga of exile. Bertrand, the steadfast engineer, ensured order amongst them, even enduring his wife's flirtations with the exiled emperor. Las Cases, a meticulous chronicler, dedicated himself to capturing Napoleon's words. The great dictator. But time, an unyielding foe, transformed into his greatest adversary. Boredom seeped into every corner of Napoleon's existence. A man of action now grappled with tedium and sleepless nights. Chess offered no real escape. Defeating opponents brought him little joy. Reading couldn't quench his thirst for conquest. He turned to dictating his memoirs. He spoke of wrongs done to Talleyrand and hasty decisions from Elba, presenting himself as a man of foresight. With an eye toward the future, he made bold predictions about the tides of history. He foresaw an end to colonialism, a unified Germany, and a new order born from chaos. He felt convinced that the ideals of the French Revolution would endure, stating, "The old system is ended, long and furious convulsions lie ahead." He believed France would secure its place in history, declaring, "In 500 years, imaginations will be full of me, the last battle." Avoiding exercise, loathing the British presence, he lost his will to live. Gardening became a mere distraction from his suffering. Illness overtook him with relentless symptoms: pain, vomiting, and sheer agony. As his body decayed, his brilliant mind remained a stark contrast to his physical state. Napoleon's final will urged restraint upon his son, advising not to seek revenge but to learn from his demise. In his final breaths, he wavered between skepticism and faith. At times he adhered to superstition, at others he faced the stark truth of mortality. When we are dead, we are altogether dead. Following an autopsy revealing stomach cancer, he found his eternal resting place on the very island that confined him, draped in a mantle from Marengo, and clutching his life sword. 19 long years passed before France could finally honor him with the rest he so ardently deserved. Chapter 40. Afterward. The family. Letizia, the matriarch, embodied the strength of a true mother. Even as they chased royal dreams, her foresight shone through. "Who knows but I may one day have to provide for all these kings." Napoleon's brothers, on the other hand, were a mixed bag. Joseph, a man of letters, acted as a loyal supporter yet sought wealth. Lucien began as an ally but transformed into an adversary, hungry for power himself. Louis chose obscurity over a throne, while Jerome embraced luxury until the Russian campaign. The sisters. Elisa, the eldest, was capable and ambitious, but Pauline was a force of her own. With unmatched beauty and kindness, she brought both joy and chaos. She was fated to spread happiness and trouble, they wrote, capturing her paradox. Her loyalty to Napoleon was unwavering, even following him to Elba during his exile. Josephine's love life was complicated, yet she had a daughter, Hortense, who found refuge with the Tsar. Eugene emerged as a symbol of steadfast loyalty, even earning respect from those who opposed him. Marie-Louise, an Austrian pawn, bore Napoleon a son and later took a lover. Homecoming. After years of war, Napoleon became a legend sculpted in memory. The soldiers, once weary, now sang his praises, recalling their glorious victories. The aging grenadier became an oracle in his village. His ability to shape narratives made him more than a leader. It rendered him a godlike figure. Convinced of his own significance, he anticipated a reckoning. When I am gone, there will be a reaction in my favor. He meticulously crafted his legend, preparing to be celebrated as a martyr. His companions became devoted disciples, spreading his message far and wide. As the French reflected on his reign, they yearned for past glories amid the austerity of their present monarchy. Chateaubriand wrote, "The world belongs to Napoleon. Dead, he possesses it." The desire for his return brewed in the nation's heart. His funeral procession through Paris marked a profound cultural moment as France finally acknowledged its mistreatment of him. Perspective. With Napoleon's death, the flame of his era began to dim. Few had burned as brightly or as long in history. Regardless of their opinions, he was a catalyst for progress and order. Napoleon provided stability, ending the chaos of the revolution. He modernized laws, secured rights, and propelled Europe into a new era. Though his impact was not universally celebrated, the Industrial Revolution and the cry for liberty from the revolution were stronger forces. In death, he transformed into an icon of liberty, molded by the public's longing for an idol. Did he merit the label of warmonger? It's not so black and white. His relentless pursuit of power led him into conflict, despite his preference for peace. He faced resistance and hostility, yet treated his enemies with fairness. Napoleon viewed his battles as a reaction to the disdain stemming from his ascent.